Keep walking, blacksmith. This business ain't yours.
Then let him prove he's not made of dust.
That's a steep price for trouble, cowboy. Some things are worth more than silver. You'll regret this, blacksmith. No. She walks free.
In the middle of a sun-scorched desert, a lone blacksmith cuts the chains off a stranger, no thanks expected. None given. She doesn't run. She stays. Keep watching to see how the woman changed his lonely life forever. The auction was already ugly by the time Jesse McCallum rode into Bitter Well. He could hear it before he saw it. That low, greedy murmur a crowd makes when it smells something it wants. He'd heard that sound before, years back, standing on the edge of a different kind of wrong. He'd ridden away from it, then told himself it wasn't his business. He was tired of riding away. Bitterwell's trading post sat squat and sunbeaten at the edge of nowhere, a scatter of adobe walls and warped timber that the desert had been trying to reclaim for 30 years. The sign above the entrance had faded so badly you couldn't read the name anymore. Didn't matter. Everybody knew what kind of town Bitterwell was. The kind where men with money made the rules, and everybody else just tried not to get stepped on. Jesse tied his roan gelding to the hitching post and adjusted the brim of his hat against the hammer of the afternoon sun. Dust coated his boots, his vest, the back of his neck. He'd ridden 2 hours from Cimarron Canyon to pick up a sack of feed and a coil of good iron wire. That was the plan. Simple. In and out before the heat got worse. But the crowd was gathered out front, not inside. Maybe 40 men packed shoulder to shoulder in the hard dirt, and they were all looking at the same thing. Jessie looked too. She was standing on an upturned crate, maybe 5 feet 4, her dark hair tangled and sun-scorched, her dress torn at the collar. Her wrists were in iron manacles, connected by a short chain, and she held them out in front of her body as though she was refusing to pretend they weren't there, as though she wanted every man watching to see exactly what this was. Her face was steady. That was the thing that hit Jessie first. Not the chains, not the blood crusting at her wrists where the iron had chewed into the skin. Her face. She wasn't crying. She wasn't begging. She was looking out over that crowd with the kind of stillness you sometimes see in a horse that's been through a hard breaking and come out the other side of it knowing something the handler doesn't. The man standing beside her was Gideon Holt. Jessie knew the name. Everybody in the canyon country knew it. Holt ran as a bounty hunter, but that was generous. He was an enforcer, plain and simple, and he worked for whoever paid the most. Right now, that was Thaddeus Vance, the mining baron who'd been swallowing up water rights and land claims across 3 territories like a man who'd decided the frontier belonged to him personally. Holt was lean and weathered in the way that mean things get weathered. Sharp jaw, pale, eyes that didn't hold any warmth even when he smiled. He was smiling now. He had a folded paper in one hand and he was waving it at the crowd like a preacher with a Bible. Court-certified, gentlemen, Holt was saying. Penalty debt, signed and sealed. This woman owes a lawful sum to the territory for damages incurred at the Palo Verde freight station. That debt is transferable by territorial statute. You pay the debt, you collect her service until it's worked off. Clean and legal. How much? Somebody called out from the back. $50 to start the bidding. There was movement in the crowd. Jesse watched a fat man in a canvas vest elbow his neighbor and grin. He watched another man pull crumpled bills from his shirt pocket and start counting. He watched a boy of maybe 14 stand on his toes to see better, learning something he shouldn't have been learning. Jesse stood still for a moment. He was doing the math he always did. The math that asked whether this was his fight, whether stepping in would make it worse, whether there was a right move here, or just a series of bad ones. Then the woman on the crate turned her head and looked directly at him. She didn't say anything, didn't call for help, didn't reach toward him. She just looked at him the way a person looks when they've stopped expecting anything from the world and they're just cataloging what's in it. Clear-eyed, measuring. Jesse stopped doing math. He pushed through the edge of the crowd, not rough about it, but not asking permission either. And men moved because something in the way he moved told them to. He was not a large man, Jesse McCallum, but he was solid in the way that iron is solid. And he'd spent 15 years at a forge, and before that 2 years riding scout for the army, and both of those lives had taught him how to take up exactly the amount of space a situation required. He stepped up to Holt. "Let me see that paper," Jesse said. Holt's pale eyes slid over him. "You got $50, friend. I got a question first. Show me the paper." There was a beat. Holt was the kind of man who liked to make other men wait just to establish the habit. But something in Jesse's expression didn't leave much room for that kind of game. So Holt unfolded the document and held it up. Jesse read it. He read it slowly. The way his mother had taught him to read anything with legal language in it, she'd said, "The man who rushes through fine print is the man who ends up signing away what he loves." He read every line. It was a court document, technically. A territorial penalty assessment from a justice of the peace in a county seat Jesse had never heard of. 200 miles south. The charges were vague. Damages. Property interference. The kind of language that could mean anything, and was written that way on purpose. The signature at the bottom was real enough. The seal looked genuine, but the debt figure was specific and large, and the transfer clause was buried in the middle, where most men wouldn't look for it. It was a trap made of paper, legal enough to wave at a crowd, thin enough to fall apart in front of a real court. But there was no real court here. There was just bitter well, and the sun, and 40 men who wanted something they had no right to want. Jesse folded the paper and handed it back. "What's the total debt?" he said. $87.50. Jesse reached into his coat. He pulled out the leather pouch he'd been carrying since Monday, the money he'd saved through the winter, selling ironwork and 3 trained quarter horses, the money he'd been planning to use to buy wire and supplies, and a new bellows for the forge. He counted it out in front of Holt. Didn't rush. Didn't look at the crowd. $87.50. He put the coins in Holt's hand one at a time. The crowd had gone quiet. Holt stared at the money. Something moved behind his pale eyes. Some calculation being made. Some decision about whether this created a problem or just a delay. Then he pocketed the coins and produced a small iron key from his vest and held it out. "Debt settled," he said. His voice was flat. "She's yours." Jesse took the key. He walked to the crate. The woman watched him come. Up close, he could see the rope burns on her forearms beneath the manacle marks, older injuries, and a cut above her left ear that was mostly healed. She'd been in Holt's custody long enough for wounds to go through stages. That detail settled into Jesse's gut like a stone dropping into water. He held up the key so she could see it. Then he held up his other hand, open, so she could see he wasn't reaching for her. He fit the key into the right manacle and turned it. The iron fell open. He did the left. The chain dropped. He caught it before it hit the crate, and he held it for a moment, the weight of it in his palm, and then he set it down on the dirt. He stepped back, one full step, giving her the space back that the chains had taken. The crowd was absolutely silent now. Jesse looked at the men watching him. Then he looked back at the woman, who was rubbing her wrists slowly, pressing her thumbs into the raw skin, and watching him with those measuring eyes. He said what needed saying. He said it loud enough for the crowd to hear, because the crowd needed to hear it too. "This silver paid for your road, not your service." His voice came out level and plain, the way he tried to say things that mattered. No human being carries a price tag in this country. Nobody spoke. The fat man in the canvas vest had put his money away. The boy of 14 was looking at his boots. Holt had his hand resting on the handle of his pistol, but he wasn't drawing it, because Jesse had just done something legal and witnessed, and he knew it. The woman on the crate looked at Jesse for a long moment. He couldn't read everything in her expression, but he caught the edge of something moving through it. Not gratitude exactly, more like recalibration. like someone adjusting the sights on a rifle after a long time of trusting shots that pulled left. She stepped down from the crate without anyone's help. She walked past Jesse without speaking. She walked through the crowd, and the crowd parted for her. She walked to the far end of the trading post's hitching area, and she stopped there, in the strip of shade thrown by the building's overhang. And she turned around and looked back at him. Not at the crowd, at him. Jesse watched her for a moment. Then he went inside and bought the wire and the feed. He needed both, and the trip was already expensive enough. When he came back out and loaded the supplies onto his pack horse, she was still there. He mounted up. He pointed his roan south and west toward the canyon. He rode. He'd gone maybe 100 yards when he checked over his shoulder out of old habit, the scout's instinct that never fully went to sleep. She was behind him, not on a horse, walking, 30 yards back, moving at an easy pace through the dust his animals had stirred up, her eyes fixed on the red hills ahead. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking where she was going. He faced forward again. He rode. She walked. Behind him, Bitterwell shrank to a brown smear against the desert, and then disappeared into the shimmer of the heat. Jesse did not slow his horses for her. He told himself it was because she hadn't asked him to. That was true enough. But it was also true that he didn't speed them up. And when he came to the first trail split, he took the longer way around, the one that ran along the creek bed where the footing was softer. He told himself that was for the pack horse, whose near foreleg had been a little stiff lately. He was aware, with a scout's precise spatial sense, of where she was the entire time. 30 yards. She kept 30 yards. Not 25, not 40. 30 like she'd measured it and decided it was the right distance. After an hour, he stopped to let the horses drink from a shallow runoff pool. He refilled his canteen, and then he filled a second canteen from his saddlebag, the one he carried for long rides, and he set it on a flat rock beside the trail, and he walked 10 feet away and watered the roan. He did not watch to see if she took it. By the time he was back in the saddle, the canteen was empty and sitting upright on the rock. The afternoon light went gold and then orange, and the shadows of the canyon walls stretched long across the scrubland. Jesse's shoulder started its familiar grinding complaint. The old damage from a bad fall off a riverbank during his scouting years, aggravated by the forge work and by cold mornings, and by the particular way it always seemed to know when the day had been hard. He rolled it once in its socket and kept riding. When he reached the canyon's mouth, the entrance to the stretch of land, where his forge and corral and small stone house sat in the shelter of the red walls, he stopped and turned his horse sideways across the trail. She came up behind him and stopped, still 30 yards out. He spoke toward the canyon because looking directly at her felt like it would be the wrong kind of pressure. "I'm Jesse McCallum. This is my land all the way to the second bend." He kept his voice easy, informational. "There's a storage shed about 200 yards in, on the east side, doors not locked, spare blankets in the cedar chest. No obligation attached. Silence. My forge is another 100 yards past that if you need water after. Dark, iron ladle on the hook. More silence. Then I know where the ladle is." Jesse turned his head. She was looking at the canyon, not at him. He waited. "I've passed through here before," she said. 2 summers ago. I know this land." "All right," Jesse said. He rode in. He didn't look back again. Not because he wasn't aware of her. He was very aware of her. But there was something in this that required him not to watch. The same way you don't stand over a spooked animal while it decides whether the danger has passed. You give it the space to make its own choice, and you stay quiet, and you let the choice be real. He put the horses up and forked hay and checked the water trough and walked through the usual end-of-day work with his mind running on a separate track, the way it did when he was working through something that didn't have a clean answer. The woman had said she'd passed through 2 summers ago. That meant she knew this canyon the way people know places they've moved through carefully, watching for threats, cataloging exits. That was not the knowledge of someone who had been free and wandering for pleasure. That was the knowledge of someone who had been running or hiding or surviving. And in this territory, for a woman alone with her heritage marked in her face, it was probably all three at once. He didn't know her name, he hadn't asked, and she hadn't offered. He built a fire in the outdoor ring and set a pot of beans on and sat with his coffee and watched the fire think about things. The canyon walls turned from red to purple to black as the sky above them deepened. Stars came out one at a time, and then all at once, the way they do in desert country where there's nothing to compete with them. Somewhere in the dark, beyond the radius of the firelight, he heard the soft sound of someone settling onto dry ground. Not close. 30 yards, he'd guess, without thinking about it. He stared at the fire for a while. He'd done something today that he couldn't fully explain, not in the simple economic language Holt had tried to use to frame it. He'd spent his winter savings because he'd seen a woman in chains, and he'd known, with the kind of bone-deep certainty that doesn't ask permission, that what was happening was wrong. Not illegal, maybe. Not by the letter of whatever piece of paper Holt had been waving, but wrong in the way that some things are wrong before any law gets written down to agree with you. He knew what it was to be on the wrong side of that kind of wrong. He'd been on the wrong side of it himself, years back, following orders he should have questioned, and riding scout through a valley he should have refused to map. He'd found out later what those maps were used for, what the so-called relief convoy had really been. That knowledge had been living in him for 8 years, quiet and heavy, like a stone in the bottom of a well. He'd built his life around the forge and the horses and the canyon and the solitude, and he'd told himself that living honestly and working hard was how a man made things right. That staying away from the kind of people who used other people was its own form of penance. Maybe it was. He still wasn't sure. He was sure of this. Today, he'd done a thing that was right, and it was the first time in a long while that the word right had felt clean in his mind, not tangled up with everything he couldn't undo. He poured the rest of his coffee onto the ground and went inside. In the morning, when he came out to start the forge, there was a small bundle on the bench beside his water barrel. It was tied with a strip of cloth he didn't recognize. He opened it carefully. Inside were 3 dried herbs. He didn't know their names, but he recognized 2 of them by smell, the way you recognize something you've encountered in passing without ever stopping to learn it. He'd seen a Navajo healer use something similar on a horse's inflamed leg once, years back. He stood there with the bundle in his hands for a moment. His shoulder had been grinding for 3 days. He looked out across the corral. She was visible at the edge of the scrubland, maybe 60 yards away, pulling something from the ground with careful, practiced hands. She wasn't looking at him. He took the herbs inside. Later that morning, he would heat water and steep them the way he'd seen done, and by afternoon, the shoulder would be easier than it had been in weeks. He would not mention this to her directly. She did not do things that required acknowledgement. She did them because they were practical and because she'd decided to, and the decision itself was the whole of the matter. He went to start the forge. Somewhere behind him, quiet, as a change in wind direction, her footsteps moved through the dust toward the scrubland, and then the desert morning swallowed the sound, and Jesse McCallum got to work. Far down the red road, back in Bitterwell, Gideon Holt was counting his money and watching the trail west with pale, patient eyes. He would not stay patient long. But that was tomorrow's problem. Today, in Cimarron Canyon, the forge fire was breathing alive, and a woman was moving through the desert in a 30-yard orbit, free, unhurried, tracking her own path across her own chosen ground. 3 days passed before Jesse learned her name. He didn't press for it. He'd spent enough time around spooked horses and wary men to know that pushing for information before someone was ready to give it was a good way to make sure you never got it. So he left her alone in the way that wasn't really alone, the way of 2 people sharing the same piece of ground without making demands on each other. She slept in the storage shed the first night. He knew because the cedar chest was open. When he passed it in the morning, the top blanket gone and then neatly replaced by afternoon. Second night, he left a second blanket on the bench outside, folded. No comment, it was gone by dark. She ate what he left on the flat sandstone slab near the water barrel. Never from his hands, never from the cook pot while he was standing near it. He'd set out a portion and walk away to check on the horses. And when he came back, the tin plate would be clean and sitting upright, and she'd be somewhere on the far side of the corral, doing something useful with her hands. That was the other thing about her. She was always doing something useful. She'd found his bucket of broken harness straps on the second morning and spent 2 hours rebraiding the salvageable sections into a serviceable lead rope. She hadn't asked if she could use them. She'd just assessed the situation, identified the waste, and corrected it. The lead rope was better work than Jesse could have done himself, and he knew leather well enough to know that. On the third morning, she was at the water barrel, washing her tin plate when he came out of the house, and she didn't move away, which told him something. She was letting the distance close by half. That was a choice, and he treated it like one. Jesse McCallum, he said, by way of a second introduction, because the first one had been shouted down a canyon at 30 yards in the dark, and it seemed polite to try again. She looked at him, clear, direct, the same measuring look from the auction crate. Then she said, "Kaya," just the one word. He nodded and went to saddle the roan. Kaya. He turned it over in his head while he worked the cinch strap. It wasn't a name he'd heard before. It sat quietly in his mind, the way certain things do when they fit where they land. The desert around Cimarron Canyon was not gentle country. It looked beautiful from a distance, all red stone and purple shadow, and the occasional flash of color, where something stubborn was flowering out of a crack in the rock. Up close, it was dry and sharp and full of things that would hurt you if you weren't paying attention. Thorns, sun, snakes sleeping under the pale rocks, the particular cruelty of a landscape that gave nothing away for free. Kaya moved through it like she'd been born, knowing its grammar. Jesse watched her from the corner of his eye while he was working, the way a careful man watches things that interest him without making a show of it. She knew which plants pulled water from the ground and which ones were full of poisons. She knew where the shade moved during the day and positioned herself accordingly without seeming to think about it. She could read the ground for tracks, he was pretty sure, maybe as well as he could, and possibly better. On the afternoon of the third day, he was riding the fence line of the east pasture, checking for breaks where the wire had gone slack, when he noticed the dust on the southern trail. He pulled the roan up and watched. A single rider, moving slow, coming from the direction of Bitterwell. Jesse stayed still for a moment, his hand resting easy near his rifle scabbard, reading the rider's pace and posture the way a scout reads them. Unhurried, no visible weapons raised. Probably not a threat. Probably just a drifter on the long road west. Probably. He didn't go back inside until the rider had passed the canyon mouth and continued south without turning. When he came back around the corral, Kaya was standing at the fence, watching where the rider had gone. Her hands were loose at her sides. Her face was still. Jesse dismounted and ran the stirrup up. "He kept moving," Jesse said. "I know," she said. "I watched." He didn't ask her whether Holt was likely to come looking. He already knew the answer to that. A man like Gideon Holt didn't let a transaction walk away from him just because the paper debt was settled. Holt had been paid to bring Kaya in for something specific, and whatever that something was, it hadn't gone away just because Jesse had handed over $87.50. He thought about asking her directly. He decided it wasn't time for that either. He put the roan up and went back to the forge. That evening, the wind picked up from the south, which meant dust, and a lot of it. Jesse had lived in the canyon long enough to read the sky's handwriting, and what the southern sky was writing by late afternoon was nothing good. He pulled the tarp over his supply pile and moved the 3 outside horses into the covered paddock and checked the forge seals before the first real gust hit. Kaya appeared at the corral fence with her arms crossed, watching the sky do what it was doing. "How long?" she said. "Tonight and maybe into tomorrow morning. These southern blows usually play out by dawn." She nodded, turned, and went back toward the storage shed. Jesse stood on the leeward side of the corral and let the first wave of stinging grit wash over him, feeling the wind's direction with his face the way his Army scout supervisor had taught him to do. He'd hated that man in most respects, but the man had known wind, and he'd been willing to teach what he knew, and that was something. The wind shifted slightly left. Jesse turned his horse until it was between Kaya and the worst of the gust, instinctive as breathing. The same thing he'd done for other riders during bad weather on the trail. He caught himself doing it after the fact. The horse was already positioned, big body cutting the wind by the time he'd consciously registered the decision. He glanced over to see if she'd noticed. She was looking at her boots, tightening the lace on the left one. If she'd noticed, she didn't show it. That was fine. He went to shut the forge down for the night. On the fourth morning, Jesse's bay mare, the one he called Dust for no good reason, except that she was the color of it, came up lame on the right foreleg. Not badly lame. A short, stiff step, a reluctance to bear full weight. Jesse ran his hands down the leg and found the heat, felt the slight swelling above the fetlock, and sat back on his heels and thought. He knew what it was. A soft tissue strain, probably from the rocky ground in the east pasture. He'd treated it before. Cold compresses, limited movement, time. The compress part was going to be difficult because his supply of proper cloth bandaging was low, and the cold water access at the trough meant standing with the horse's leg submerged for stretches, which meant time he needed to be at the forge, finishing a commission that was 2 days late already. Kaya appeared at the paddock entrance. She looked at Dust. She looked at the leg. She looked at Jesse. "Horehound and arrowweed," she said. "If you've got either one dried." Jesse thought about the bundles he'd seen in the cedar chest the one time he'd opened it to check the blankets. She'd been building a supply of something. "I might have horehound, back shelf in the storeroom. I'll need a clean cloth and a flat stone for grinding. I can get those." That was the whole conversation. Jessie went and got what she asked for and brought it to the paddock fence and set it on the post without comment. She took the cloth and stone and her own dried supplies and went to work, and Jessie went to the forge, and sometime in the middle of the morning, when he came to the paddock to check, Dust was standing quietly, with a poultice wrapped tight above the fetlock, and Kaya was at the far end of the paddock, doing something with a halter that had needed adjustment. The bay's eyes were half closed, relaxed. Whatever Kaya had used, it was working. Jesse stood at the fence for a minute. He was aware of owing her something. Not a debt in the Holt sense, not a transaction, but the ordinary human accounting between people who help each other and know it. He thought about how to say that without making it sound like a debt. He couldn't figure it out, so he went back to the forge. That afternoon, he left an extra portion on the flat stone. Not because the morning's work demanded payment, just because she'd worked through the heat of the day, and she'd probably burned through whatever she'd eaten at dawn. He put a handful of dried apricots on the side of the plate because he'd been hoarding them since fall, and he didn't have a good reason to keep hoarding them. The plate came back clean. The apricots were gone. He counted that as a good afternoon. By the fifth day, they'd settled into a rhythm. Not a spoken one, not a negotiated one. It built itself the way things build when two people are both practical and both paying attention. Jesse started the fire. Coffee sat on the hearthstone. There was always a second cup's worth in the pot. By the time she passed by the fire on her morning circuit of the property, and there was always a flat stone in a convenient place with food on it, and there was always, though neither of them mentioned it, a distance between them that was comfortable rather than tense. She washed her own plate, every time, without fail, before she set it back on the rock. Jessie noticed this and understood it for what it was. She was being scrupulous about taking nothing for free, about leaving no obligation, about existing in his space in a way that required nothing from him. It was discipline, the discipline of someone who had learned that dependency was a door that opened from the inside and could be locked against you from the outside. Jesse had his own version of that discipline. He'd built it during the scout years, and then again during the long quiet of the canyon. After he'd come home with his guilt and his craft and his determination to live small and cause no harm, he recognized the shape of it in someone else. On the fifth afternoon, he was checking the cinch on his pack saddle when he heard a sound behind him and turned to find her standing at the saddle rack, her hands working over the buckle that he'd been meaning to fix for 3 weeks. The pin was worn, the leather around it cracked, and the buckle had been slipping under load in a way that was annoying at best and dangerous at worst. She had a small awl in one hand. She was working the leather with the focused attention of someone who'd done this kind of repair many times. Jesse watched her for a moment. "I've got a proper leather punch in the shop," he said. "I know. I borrowed it this morning." He looked at the work table. The punch was sitting in a different place than he'd left it, cleaned and replaced. He turned back to the horses. "Buckle's been giving me trouble since last winter," he said to the general direction of the paddock. "It'll hold now," she said. He didn't check her work because checking it would have implied he doubted it, and nothing she'd done in 5 days had given him any reason for doubt. He moved the roan to the other rail and started checking hooves, working down the offside, and the afternoon settled around them both like something unhurried. The canyon walls were orange gold in the slant light. A pair of canyon wrens were arguing in the sage somewhere above the south ridge. Dust, with her poulticed leg, stood in the shade of the covered paddock and slept on her feet. Jesse's shoulder was still easier than it had been in weeks. The 5th night, he woke up at 2 in the morning from a dream he didn't want to remember and lay in the dark listening to the canyon. The wind had come up again, smaller than the sun blow, just a dry night breath moving through the sage. He lay there and thought about the cavalry insignia in his toolbox. He hadn't thought about it in a while, which was its own kind of guilt. It was easier not to think about things you couldn't change. He'd gotten good at not thinking about the valley, about the families he'd helped displace with his careful maps and his precise route surveys, telling himself he was just doing the scouting work, and the decisions were made by men above him. That was true. It was also not enough. He thought about Kaya moving through her morning circuit of the canyon property, checking the fence line and the water trough and the paddock gates with the automatic efficiency of someone who knows that survival depends on knowing your perimeter. He thought about how she kept 30 yards of space around her, like it was armor she'd built over time. He thought about how she'd been in iron chains in a trading post, and how Gideon Holt had held a piece of paper like it was a leash. He thought about the look on her face on that crate, the absolute refusal to perform what was being demanded of her. He put his arm over his eyes and stared at the inside of his own arm in the dark. He didn't know her story. He knew the shape of the injustice and not its specific history, not what road had led her to Bitterwell, or what Vance wanted from her badly enough to have Holt running her down with false court papers. There were pieces he was missing. He'd get them when she was ready to share them, not before. He closed his eyes and went back to sleep and didn't dream anything else. On the 6th morning, she spoke more than she had since giving him her name. She was crouched in the scrubland east of the corral, digging at the base of a spiny-looking plant with a flat stone when Jesse came out with his coffee. He was heading for the fence to check the wire from yesterday's wind, and he passed close enough that it would have been strange not to acknowledge her. So he slowed. She held up the root she'd dug. It was pale and woody, forked at the bottom. "Desert willow," she said, "the inner bark. You steep it and strain it, and it keeps longer than you'd think. Good for chest sickness. Also for inflammation." She glanced at his shoulder. "Better than what I gave you the first time." Jesse looked at the root, then at her. I didn't know you noticed this shoulder. You roll it when it hurts. You've done it probably 40 times since I've been here. He'd had no idea he did that. 40 times is a lot, he said. 38, she said. I might have miscounted 2. He thought he caught the edge of something in her voice. Not quite humor, but the shape of where humor might live in someone who hadn't had much use for it lately. He didn't make a thing of it. I'll get a pot of water going, he said, and went to build up the fire. She came to the fire with the root and did her work at the far edge of the ring, her back partly turned, and Jesse sat on the upturned crate he used as a morning seat and drank his coffee, and they were quiet together for a while. The root simmered in the small pot, and the steam smelled clean, a little sharp, like something from deep in the earth that the earth had been making for a long time. Kaya strained it through a scrap of cloth and poured it into one of the tin cups and set the cup on the flat stone between them. Jesse picked it up. It was bitter and strong and tasted like the desert smelled before a rain. He drank it without making a face because he'd drunk worse things in worse places for worse reasons, and also because she'd made it, and she was watching him from the corner of her eye to see if he would. Thank you, he said. She nodded once and went back to the scrubland. His shoulder, by the middle of the afternoon, felt better than it had in 3 years. Jesse was at the forge by late morning, working a set of door hinges for a rancher in the next valley, when he noticed the pack saddle buckle. She'd fixed it. He knew that. But she'd also oiled the straps on either side of it, the ones that were still technically serviceable, but going dry and stiff at the edges. He hadn't mentioned those. She'd seen them when she was working the buckle, and she'd addressed them because they were there and needed addressing. And she hadn't said anything about it because it hadn't required saying anything about. Jesse set his hammer down for a moment. He thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who fixed what was in front of them without being asked and without making a debt of it. He thought about how rare that was. He'd met men who wouldn't lift a hand without an accounting. Men who did kindnesses with their hand out behind them. Men who needed the debt to feel the goodness of the act. He thought about how Kaya's way of moving through the world was built on a completely different idea. That you did what needed doing because it needed doing, and that was the whole transaction, complete in itself, no remainder. He was 41 years old, and he was learning something from someone who hadn't spoken 300 words to him in 6 days. He picked up his hammer and went back to work. Outside, the canyon was quiet. The horses stood drowsy in the afternoon heat. Dust's leg was better, the swelling down, the short step smoothing out to something closer to normal. The poultice had worked the way Kaya had known it would work, because she'd seen it work before. And she carried that knowledge the way Jesse carried his forge skills. Not as a gift, but as a thing earned through time and attention. On the flat stone by the water barrel, a small bundle of desert willow bark sat drying in the sun for the next batch. She'd left it there while he was in the forge. He hadn't asked her to. She'd done it because it was practical, and because she'd decided to, and somewhere in the canyon, on her morning circuit, or her herb-gathering rounds, she was moving through the red country at exactly the distance she chose, on ground she'd decided to be on, by a choice that was entirely her own. Jesse McCallum, alone in his forge, kept the bellows moving and the iron hot. Down the red road, out past the canyon mouth and the scrubland, and the long miles back to Bitter Well, something was coming that neither of them was ready for yet. But the 6th day was still the 6th day, and it was still quiet, and for now that was enough. The storm announced itself the way the worst ones always do, quietly at first. Jesse noticed the sky at midday. The light had gone strange, that flat, yellowish cast that bleaches the color out of everything and makes the red canyon walls look pale. The air had gone still, in a way that wasn't peaceful. It was the stillness of something holding its breath. He'd seen enough desert weather to know what was coming. A sandstorm. A bad one. The kind that the canyon could channel and accelerate, that could drive grit through the gaps in a door, and into the corners of your eyes, and into the mechanisms of anything with moving parts. He spent the next hour securing what needed securing. He covered the supply pile, moved the horses into the paddock, pulled the leather aprons off the fence posts, and into the shop. He checked the forge seals and closed the shutters on the two small windows and piled rags against the base of the door. Kaya appeared at the forge entrance when he was about halfway through. She looked at the sky, then at what he was doing. She went and moved the horses without being asked, resettling them farther back in the covered paddock, away from the opening, the way someone moves livestock in weather when they know exactly what they're doing. She used the lead rope she'd braided herself, and she spoke to the animals in a low voice that Jesse couldn't quite hear from where he stood. But the horses responded to it, walking calmly where she directed. "We've got maybe 30 minutes, Jesse said. "Less," she said, coming back toward the forge. "Feel the east wall, it's already warm." He put his hand flat on the canyon's east face. She was right. The rock was holding heat at an unusual angle, the way it did when the wind was pushing from a direction it didn't usually come from. That meant a rotational storm, possibly a long one. "Shop's sealed as good as I can get it," he said. She walked past him into the forge without ceremony. He followed. The forge was not a large space. Jesse had built it himself over 2 years, adding to it as he could, and what it amounted to was a stone-walled room about 20 feet by 16, with the furnace at the north end, an anvil on its oak block in the center, and shelves and racks along the 2 long walls holding his tools, his stock iron, his coal supply, his various clamps and mandrels and swages. There was a workbench along the east wall, and a low stool, and an upturned barrel that served as a second seat. It smelled like coal smoke and hot metal, and the particular mineral sharpness of worked iron. Jesse had always found the smell steadying. It was the smell of things being made. He pulled the door shut behind them and dropped the bar. Outside, the wind started. Not the gradual build of an ordinary blow. It came on fast, the way a door slams, and within 2 minutes it was a full roar against the stone walls, and the light coming through the seams around the shutters turned orange, and then brown, and then nearly nothing. Jesse lit the oil lamp on the workbench, and then the second one on the shelf above the anvil. The forge itself had burned down to coals, banked for the evening, and it threw a low, steady glow from its iron mouth. Kaya stood near the east wall, not near him, but not at the full length of the room either. She'd crossed her arms. She was looking at the shelves. Jesse picked up the hinge work he'd left unfinished and sat at the workbench. He wasn't going to fire the forge up again tonight. Not with the storm, bad ventilation, but he could do the cold work. Filing, fitting, marking. He had enough lamp oil for 4 or 5 hours. The storm outside settled into a sustained shriek, the canyon walls doing what they always did, turning the wind's direction and amplifying it. So what might have been a strong blow in open country became something that sounded like the whole desert was coming apart. They sat in it together. The lamp threw long shadows. The coals in the forge shifted once and sent up a brief orange flutter of light. Jesse filed the edge of a hinge plate. Kaya had picked up a piece of harness that was sitting on the second stool, one Jesse had set aside because the stitching had come loose and she was working at it with the small awl she seemed to carry everywhere. Her hands knew what to do without her thinking about it. 20 minutes went by, maybe more. Jesse had moved to the shelf on the east wall to find the right gauge of iron rod when he saw it. He'd forgotten it was there. That was the truth of it, and the truth sat badly with him. He'd had the toolbox on that shelf for 3 years, and he opened the main drawer regularly for drill bits and gauges, but the side compartment, the one with the latch, he almost never went into. He'd put the insignia in there when he came back from the army, and he'd stopped thinking about it the way a person stops thinking about a bruise after the tenderness fades, except the fading is just getting used to it, not getting over it. The latch on the side compartment had come undone in the wind vibration. The compartment was open about an inch. He reached to close it. He was a second too slow. Kaya had stood from the stool to stretch her legs, and she was passing the shelf when the lamp on the wall threw its light directly into the open gap. She stopped. She looked at it for a moment. Then she reached out and opened the compartment fully. Inside was a folded piece of wool, gray-blue, and pinned to it was a brass insignia, the chevron and crossed sabers of an Army Scout regiment. Below the regiment number was a unit designation that Jessie knew she could read because she'd mentioned once, in passing, that the mission school they'd sent her to as a girl had been thorough, at least about that. She lifted the insignia out of the compartment. She turned it over in her hands. Her face had gone somewhere he couldn't follow. Jessie set the iron rod down on the shelf. He said quietly, "Kaya." She looked up at him. Her eyes were different. Whatever steadiness she'd built up over 10 days in the canyon had shifted, and underneath it was something older and rawer and completely real. "Where did you serve?" she said. He told her. She said the valley's name. Not a question. "Yes," he said. She put the insignia back in the compartment. Then she put it on the shelf. Her hand found the small knife at her belt, a horn-handled skinning knife, and she drew it in one practiced motion, and she had him backed against the far edge of the workbench with the blade, at a conversational distance from his ribs. All of this in the time it took him to draw one breath. Her hand was absolutely steady. Jessie did not move. He did not put his hands up. He didn't beg or explain. He met her eyes and stayed still. The forge coals breathed their low orange light. The storm screamed outside. He could see it in her face. He couldn't name all of it, and it wasn't his place to try. He knew the valley. He knew what the scouting work had led to. He'd heard afterward, when it was too late to matter, about the families who'd lost their water access, their seasonal grounds, their ability to get from one part of the land to the other without crossing through someone else's claimed territory. He'd heard about it from Heman, who heard things because Heman listened and because people trusted him with what they heard. Jessie had known in the abstract way of guilt that lives in the chest without a specific face on it. Now it had a face. The knife didn't waver. He spoke carefully, not fast, not with the breathless pace of a man trying to talk his way out of something. "I won't use regret to beg for your pardon," he said. "You have every right to hate that badge, but I will see you safe before you decide what to do with that blade." Kaya looked at him. The storm hit a peak outside, something large scraping along the canyon wall, and neither of them moved. "You scouted the valley," she said. "Yes, you mapped the routes. They told you it was a relief mission. They told me the surveys were for a resettlement convoy, that they were documenting the area to establish water access for the families already there." He kept his voice flat, factual. "They lied. I found out afterward what the surveys were used for. A land seizure operation. What they called a voluntary removal." "Voluntary," she said. "I know what that word means in that sentence." She studied him. Something was working behind her eyes, a calculation that had nothing to do with math. It was the kind of assessment that people make when they're deciding whether someone is lying about the thing they claim to feel, when they're trying to separate the guilt that wants absolution from the guilt that just has to be carried. Jessie held still and let her do it. "My mother's family had 3 generations in that valley," Kaya said. "The Eastern Spring was ours by memory and by use for 60 years. By the time your maps were done with us, we couldn't reach the water without trespassing on claimed land. I know." "You know," she repeated. "It's not enough," he said. "Knowing isn't enough. I'm not telling you that to get the knife away from my ribs. I'm telling you because it's the only honest thing I have." The lamp on the workbench flickered as the storm sent a thread of dust through some crack Jessie hadn't found. The light shifted and steadied. Kaya's knife hand was still steady. Her eyes moved over his face with that careful, field survey attention she brought to everything. She was reading him. He knew it, and he let her. Whatever she read, she didn't say. She lowered the knife. She didn't sheath it immediately. She held it at her side for a moment, looking at the insignia in the open compartment. Then she sheathed it. She turned and went back to the stool and picked up the harness and went back to work. On the stitching, Jesse stood at the workbench for a moment. Then he sat down and picked up the hinge plate and the file and went back to the cold work. The storm went on for another 2 hours. They didn't speak again for a long time. The silence was different now. It had a different texture. Not the comfortable silence of two practical people working in shared space. This was the silence of something that had been said and couldn't be unsaid, and both of them sitting in its aftermath, doing the only thing available to people in that situation, which was continuing to exist and continuing to work. Jesse filed the hinge plate. He checked the fit. He marked the hole positions with his scribe. He did it all with the focused attention of a man who knows that good work requires full presence, and he tried to be fully present and mostly managed it. He thought about what it meant to confess something without asking for forgiveness. He'd done it before, with Heman, the one person who'd known him before the scout, years and after. Heman had listened, and then he'd said, plain as anything. That regret didn't repair what was broken, but it was better than not having it. He'd said it, the way he said most things, simply, without theater. Then he'd poured them both a drink and gone back to his leather work. Jesse had held on to that. It wasn't redemption. It was just the truth that living with the knowledge was better than not having it. Kaya stitched the harness with quick, even movements. She worked through the worst of the storm without looking up. Her hands knew the work and let her mind go wherever it needed to go. Jesse didn't intrude on it. When the storm began to lose its voice, the roar settling to a sustained rush and then a grumble, and then the occasional gust between stretches of near quiet, Jesse checked the shutters and found the gaps dark and still. He added a measure of coal to the forge and worked the bellows until the fire came back up properly. Because the shop had cooled in the last hour, the temperature at night in the canyon could drop faster than you expected. The heat spread through the room. Kaya set the finished harness down on the stool. She looked at her work, running her thumb along the stitching to check it. It was good. He could see that even from across the room. She looked at the insignia, still sitting in the open compartment. He watched her look at it. She didn't touch it again. After a moment, she looked away. Jesse picked up the insignia and put it back in the compartment and closed the latch. He put a small wax seal over it, from the tin on the shelf. He pressed his thumb into the wax. He didn't do it to lock the compartment against her. He did it because the thing needed to be put away with intention, not just forgotten again. That was the difference between burying something and setting it down consciously in a place where you knew it was. Kaya watched him do this. He met her eyes. She looked back at him for a moment, expressionless, reading him again. Then she looked away toward the forge. The fire's pulling a little left, she said. Jessie looked at the forge. She was right. The draw was uneven, probably a gap somewhere in the stack that the storm had loosened. I'll check the stack in the morning, he said. You'll need to repack the upper joint, she said. I can see the gap from here. He looked at the upper joint of the chimney stack. At the edge of the firelight's reach, there was a gap, small but real. He hadn't seen it. You're right, he said. She picked up the harness from the stool and hung it on the proper hook. Then she looked at the door. Storm's passing, she said. Getting there. She unbarred the door and pushed it open 6 inches and looked out. The canyon was full of settled dust, the air thick and still gritty, but the wind was down. The stars overhead were visible through the haze, pale and scattered. She pushed the door fully open and stood in the entrance. Jesse came and stood at the other side of the doorframe, leaning against the stone. They looked at the canyon together. The torch on the paddock post was buried in dust to the halfway mark. The horses were moving in the covered paddock, restless now that the sound had stopped, horses always being uncertain whether quiet after storm meant safety or just a different danger. "I'll check the stock," she said. Jessie nodded. She went out into the dusty dark, and he listened to her footsteps, and then to the low sounds she made. When she reached the paddock, the same barely audible voice she used on the animals. He heard dust shift and settle. He heard the bay gelding stop his anxious movement. He went back into the forge and sat down on the barrel. He put his hands flat on his knees and looked at the fire. He'd said what was true, and she'd heard it. And she'd put the knife away, and neither of them had pretended. That made anything simple. He wasn't sure what happened next. He wasn't sure what she would do with what she'd found out, or whether the space they'd built between them over 10 days could hold the weight of this new thing in it. But she'd gone to check on the horses. That was something. She'd taken care of a task that needed doing, in the place she'd been staying, for the animals she'd been helping with, as though whatever had happened in the forge, in the last 2 hours, was a thing she was going to carry and continue moving with at the same time. That took a particular kind of strength, the kind that doesn't announce itself. Jessie thought about what she'd said about her mother's family. 3 generations, an eastern spring, 60 years of water and use and memory, and then a set of maps that a young Army scout had made in good faith for liars. And all of it gone. He thought about what it meant that she was here, in his canyon, at his forge. 10 days after, he'd cut her chains in a trading post, moving through his land with her desert-reading eyes and her herb knowledge and her 30 yards of chosen distance, treating every act of exchange between them as a transaction that needed to be balanced, refusing to owe or to be owed, building something that looked like trust from the outside, but was probably just the absence of fear, slowly becoming something else. He didn't know what to call it yet. He wasn't sure she did either. He stayed in the forge until she came back from the paddock and passed the doorway without stopping, and went toward the storage shed. He heard her footsteps in the dust. He heard the shed door. He heard quiet. He put the fire down to a safe bank and blew out the lamp on the shelf. He sat in the forge light for 1 more minute, the red glow of the coals and the cooling smell of iron. And then he got up and went to bed. In the morning, early, before the sun cleared the canyon walls, Jessie was on the roof of the forge with a caulking tool and a bucket of clay sand mix, repacking the upper joint of the chimney stack. He heard her below. He looked down. Kaya was standing at the base of the forge wall, looking up at him. She had a cup of coffee in each hand. He came down the side ladder. She held one of the cups out. He took it. They stood in the early canyon light, the air still dust-heavy and cool, the walls going from gray to pink as the sun climbed, and they drank their coffee and didn't say anything at all. The wax seal on the compartment latch was still there. The harness hung on its hook. The hinges were filed and fitted and waiting for the morning fire to be properly attached. Somewhere above the south ridge, the canyon wrens were starting up again. Jessie looked at his coffee. He thought that most of the things that mattered never got fully said. They got built, piece by piece, in small acts between people who were paying attention to each other. In a cup of coffee, brought before the day started. In a knife, put back in its sheath. In the truth, told without using it to ask for anything. He wasn't sure what Kaya thought about any of this, but she was here, still here, on the 8th morning, in her canyon-reading orbit, drinking coffee in the gray-pink light. And down the long road toward Bitterwell, Gideon Holt was not being patient anymore. Heman Cross arrived on a Tuesday, which was unusual. He made the ride from his tannery in the lowlands every 2 weeks or so, and it was almost never a Tuesday. He saved Tuesdays for his leather work, the detailed stitching and tooling that needed the morning light coming in from the east window of his shop at the right angle. The fact that he'd left his shop on a Tuesday meant he had something to say that couldn't wait for his regular schedule. Jessie saw him coming from half a mile out, that big gray mule moving at a pace that was faster than Heman's usual amble. He set his hammer down and came to the corral fence and waited. Heman pulled up at the gate. He was a broad man, somewhere in his mid-50s, with hands that were scarred and dark and extraordinarily capable. He'd lost 2 fingers on his left hand at Chancellorsville and had learned to work leather with 8 fingers so well that most people who hired him didn't notice until the 3rd or 4th visit. He wore a canvas coat regardless of the weather, and a hat that had been reshaped by sweat and time into something entirely its own. He looked at Jessie from the back of the mule. Then he looked past Jessie at the canyon. "She's still here," he said. "Yes," Jessie said. Heman nodded. "Slow, good. Because what I'm about to tell you concerns her more than it concerns you." He dismounted and tied the mule to the post and followed Jessie into the shade of the covered paddock, where they could talk without broadcasting to the open air. Jessie brought a water bucket, and Heman drank from his canteen, and then they stood together in the way of men who've known each other long enough to skip the preamble. "Holt came through Mira Crossing 4 days ago," Heman said. "Stopped at the feed store. Asked questions. Mentioned a woman. Mixed heritage. Traveling alone. I heard it from Clarence at the feed store, who heard it from the Okafor girl, who was stocking shelves and not visible over the barrels. What kind of questions? The kind a man asks when he's got a direction and needs to confirm it." Heman looked at him steadily. "But that's not the main thing. The main thing I came to tell you is about the surveys." Jessie waited. "You know Vance has been buying up the water basin. Claims south of here. 3 ranches in the last year. Everybody thought he was just doing what Vance does, spending money to make more money, buying dry land cheap. That's what everybody thought. Everybody was wrong." Heman took his hat off and turned it in his hands. "What Vance is actually doing is siting a sluice operation for a mercury extraction process at the new mine. Mercury processing requires a lot of water and generates contaminated runoff. He's been running test operations for 8 months, and the runoff's been going into the South Tributary. He let that sit for a moment, which feeds the main basin." Jessie understood water in the canyon country the way people understand the language they grew up speaking. He knew exactly what the South Tributary fed and where those waters went and who depended on them. "That's every ranch in the lower valley," he said, "and 2 native seasonal grounds, and the Bitter Well trading post cistern." Heman put his hat back on. "But here's the part that brings Holt into it. There's a set of original territorial survey documents, pre-Vance, that establish the water rights for the whole basin. Legal, registered, comprehensive. Those documents would put Vance's entire operation in violation of territorial water law. They'd void his purchase claims on 3 of the ranches and expose him to federal prosecution." Jessie looked at him. Heman looked back. "She has them," Jessie said. It wasn't quite a question. "That's what I hear." A woman matching her description was working as a document translator and courier for a territorial land office 2 years ago. When the office was raided and the official records went missing, she was the one who got out with the original surveys. Vance has been trying to get them back since. That's why Holt had her in Bitterwell. "The debt paper was theater," Heman said. "They needed her compliant and visible so they could move her without making it look like what it was. If they'd just taken her on the road, that's kidnapping. This way it looked like a lawful transfer." He paused. "You paid the debt and took the legal ground out from under them, which means Holt can't use that paper anymore. But it also means Vance knows the surveys are somewhere in this canyon." The paddock was quiet around them. Dust moved her leg, the injured foreleg, easy and unrestricted now, the last of the swelling gone. Outside, the canyon was doing its afternoon thing, the light going gold, the shadows of the walls stretching. Jessie thought about all of it. He arranged what Heman had told him into the right order, and then he thought about what it meant going forward. "How good is Holt's direction?" he said. "Does he know she's here specifically? He knows she went west from Bitterwell. He'll know she didn't make it to any of the towns further along. This canyon is the only shelter between Bitterwell and the next valley." Heman's voice was level. "He'll come here. Might be a week. Might be 3 days. I wouldn't count on a week. Jesse nodded. Heman studied him for a moment. You're not surprised. I figured there was more to it than a court debt. There usually is, with Holt. Jesse looked across the corral to where Kaya was visible at the edge of the scrubland, moving through her herb-gathering circuit. She had a tied bundle in one hand, and she was crouched at something low to the ground, inspecting a plant with the focused attention she brought to everything in the desert. She didn't know yet that Heman was here. Or maybe she did. She probably did. She didn't miss much. I need to tell her what you've told me, Jesse said. I'd expect so, Heman said. It's her situation more than yours. It became mine when I paid that debt. Heman was quiet for a moment, looking at the woman in the scrubland. His expression was thoughtful, not without approval. I noticed you put that plainly, he said. Became yours. You know what you're taking on. I know what Vance is, Jesse said. And I know what happens to people in the way of what Vance wants. He's got hired guns, Heman said. Not just Holt. Vance keeps 4 or 5 men on the payroll who aren't cowboys. You'd know them if you saw them. They ride 2 straight and they watch exits. I've met that type before. I know you have. Heman picked up his canteen and capped it. I also know you've been up in this canyon building iron things and raising horses for 3 years and not looking for any kind of fight. No, Jesse said. I haven't been looking for one. Heman looked at him. Something passed between them that had the weight of a longer conversation. Years of knowing each other, knowing each other's histories. All right, Heman said simply. Kaya came back from the scrubland as the afternoon was tipping toward evening, and she stopped at the edge of the corral when she saw the gray mule at the post. Her hand shifted toward the knife at her belt, and then stilled when she saw Jesse's posture. He was standing in the open with his arms loose at his sides, no tension in his shoulders. Someone he knew then. Someone safe, at least relatively. She came to the paddock fence. Jesse introduced them without ceremony. Heman Cross. He runs the tannery at Mira Crossing. He's been my neighbor in the canyon country for 12 years. Heman looked at her directly, and with respect, not the evaluating kind that men used when they were deciding what a woman was worth to them, but the simple, straightforward attention of someone meeting a person they've heard about. Miss Kaya, he said. Mr. Cross, she said. Jesse looked at her. Heman came to bring us information about Holt and about the surveys. Something in her expression changed, small but visible. She looked at Heman and then at Jesse and then back at Heman. What do you know about the surveys? She said. Heman told her what he'd told Jesse. He told it the same way, plain and ordered, without dramatizing any of it. He watched her face while he talked. Kaya listened the way she did everything, with complete attention, standing still, her eyes moving between his face and the middle distance as she processed what she heard. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. The documents are safe, she said. I'm not going to say where. That's sensible, Heman said. Vance can't get to them without getting to me first. That's the design. It's a good design, Heman said. But it puts you in a particular kind of danger. I know what kind of danger I'm in, she said. Her voice was even. I've been in it for 2 years, Heman nodded. He didn't argue with that. He looked at Jesse and then back at Kaya with the expression of someone who's delivered the news he came to deliver and is now trying to figure out whether he's in the way. I'll stay the night if there's space, he said to Jesse. Then I'll get back. I've got 3 orders waiting, and I can't afford Vance's people deciding I'm connected to this if I'm away too long. Storage shed's your usual, Jesse said. Heman went to settle his mule, and Jesse turned to Kaya. She was looking at the south end of the canyon, toward the mouth, toward the long road that connected this place to Bitter Well and everything in that direction. He'll be here within the week, she said. That's my read, too. What does your spring feed, she said. Your water supply, where does it come from? Rock Spring, northeast face. It's fed from the upper aquifer. Comes out at the second bend in the canyon wall. She turned to look at him. Does the south tributary reach it? Jesse worked it out in his head. The geography of the underground water, the way the aquifer moved through the rock, the places where it surfaced. He thought about what Heman had said about the mercury runoff and the south tributary and the basin. If Vance's contamination has reached the main basin, he said slowly, and the main basin feeds the upper aquifer at the pressure point near the canyon entrance, then yes, she said, it would reach your spring. Eventually. Maybe already. The water for his horses came from that spring. His herd, 17 animals, the product of 3 years of careful breeding, the financial core of everything he'd built in the canyon. Jesse thought about mercury, contamination in water. He knew enough to know it was serious, and enough to know he didn't know the details. How long, he said. Depends on the volume of contamination and how long it's been running. Could be months before the symptoms show in large animals. Could be faster. She looked at him steadily. You need to test your current water. How? Freshwater plants. Watercress, if you have it near the spring, or stonewort. Mercury contamination changes them. They die or they grow distorted. She paused. Also check your horse's gum tissue. If the color is off, or if they're showing excessive salivation, I'll check them tonight. Check dust first. She's been here longest and drinking from the trough the whole time. Jesse turned and went to the paddock without another word. Dust's gums were normal. Jesse checked all 17 horses before the light failed, going through each one with the methodical calm of a man who knows that panic in a paddock is contagious and that calm hands produce better information. Gums, eyes, nasal discharge, the general alertness and responsiveness of each animal. 15 of the 17 were fully normal. 2 of the younger ones were showing slightly elevated salivation. It might be nothing. Young horses in stress conditions produced more saliva, but it might not be nothing. He came back to the fire and told Kaya and Heman what he'd found. Kaya was already doing something at the edge of the firelight with a flat stone and a bundle of dried plant material. She looked up when he reported the 2 young horses. Those 2, she said. Are they on the same side of the paddock? The east side. Both of them drink from the east end of the trough. Where does the trough water come in? East side. Comes down from the spring through an open channel. She looked at the flat stone. The contamination enters with the inflow and settles toward the inlet end before it disperses. The horses closest to the inlet are getting the highest exposure. She looked up at him. You need to cut the channel and haul water from a different source until you know what you're dealing with. There's a surface seep on the West Canyon wall, Jesse said, higher up. Different source, separate from the main aquifer access. Use that. It's a slow seep. I'll have to haul. I know, she said. We'll have to haul. Jesse looked at her. She was already grinding the dried plant material on the flat stone. Activated charcoal and juniper ash, she said, working. You add it to the water in the trough in the right proportion, and it binds with heavy metal contaminants. It's not a permanent solution, but it buys time and reduces the exposure load while you switch sources. She kept grinding. I'll need your charcoal from the forge and whatever juniper you have drying. I've got both. Charcoal's in the bin by the east wall. Get it. Jesse got it. He came back with the charcoal, and she measured it by eye into the mixture she was preparing, and told him the ratio and had him note it. How much per gallon of trough water? How often to change the additive? What changes in the horse's condition to watch for? She delivered this information the way she delivered all information, directly and without embellishment. And Jesse listened and absorbed it, and didn't waste time with questions that weren't necessary. Heman sat on the far side of the fire and watched them work. He was quiet. He had the look of a man who is observing something carefully and forming thoughts about it that he'll share only when asked. Jesse cut the water channel at midnight with a flat stone and a hand spade, diverting the flow away from the trough and into the ground. Then he started hauling from the west seep. Kaya held the lamp while he worked. She found a second bucket in the storage shed and hauled alongside him, trip after trip up the rocky path to the seep and back down to the trough, saying nothing, just working. The seep filled a bucket in about 8 minutes. It was slow work. By the time the trough was at a useful level, it was past 2 in the morning, and Jesse's shoulder was burning, and his hands were rope-sore from the bucket handles. He sat down on the upturned crate by the paddock fence. Kaya set her bucket down and looked at the trough level. "It'll hold until morning," she said. "We'll need to start a regular schedule. 2 hauls at dawn, 2 at midday, 2 at sundown. That's 6 trips a day," Jesse said. "That's what it takes." He nodded. He already knew it. He looked at the horses, settled for the night, the 2 young ones standing quieter than they had before he'd started the haul. Maybe that was imagination. Probably he just wanted it to be true. "The surveys," he said, to the night air between them. "If they show what Heman sends us they show. If they establish the water rights properly and put Vance's operation in violation. How solid is that case?" Kaya sat down on the ground near the paddock fence, her back against the post. She pulled her knees up and rested her arms on them. "The surveys are registered originals," she said. "Pre-territorial reorganization, which means they predate Vance's purchase agreements. A federal territorial court would have to recognize them." She paused. "The problem is getting them to a federal territorial court. Vance controls the local justice of the peace. He has connections in the district office. Getting the documents in front of someone who can actually act on them is the obstacle." "Marshall Thorne," Jesse said. She looked at him. "You know Thorne?" "I know of him. He works out of the Northern District office. He's not Vance's man. He's honest, from what I hear, though he's careful about jurisdictional lines." "Careful is a problem," Kaya said. "Careful men wait for clear authority before they act. Vance will create delays and jurisdictional complications that give Holt time to operate." "Thorne's also stubborn," Jesse said. "When he decides a thing is his business, it stays his business. The jurisdictional caution cuts both ways. He won't be pushed around by Vance's money either." Kaya was quiet, thinking about this. "The surveys, plus your military documentation," she said. "Your scouting records. Would you have anything from the Valley Survey that cross-references the water basin claims?" Jesse thought about the logbooks in the steel box under the floorboard in the house. He hadn't opened them in 3 years. He hadn't wanted to look at them. "I have my survey logs from the Canyon Country campaign," he said. "All of it. Every route, every water source I documented. If those logs show the same basin sources as the original territorial surveys, they corroborate the prior rights claim." She looked at him directly. Vance's lawyers would have a harder time dismissing 2 independent documentation sources from different periods. Jesse understood what she was asking him to do with those logs. To open them, to go back through every page, to use the record of his worst mistake as part of the argument against the people that mistake had benefited. There was something almost exact about that. "I'll get them out in the morning," he said. She held his eyes for a moment. Then she looked back at the horses. They sat by the paddock fence in the canyon dark. The fire had burned down to coals. The spring seep on the west wall made its small sound, trickling into the channel he'd cut, to funnel it for tomorrow's hauling. Heman had gone to the storage shed an hour ago without announcement. Jesse's hands were sore from the bucket work. Kaya had a smear of charcoal ash on her forearm from the grinding. They were both tired in the way of people who've done necessary work at an hour when they would rather have been sleeping, and neither of them was complaining about it. "The mercury," Jesse said. "Is it in your spring too? Your family's valley?" Kaya looked at the coals for a while before answering. "I don't know," she said. "I haven't been back." He didn't push at that. He knew about places you hadn't been back to. He knew how much room they took up anyway, how present they were, even when you were nowhere near them. "When this is done," he said and stopped. She waited. He sorted through what he'd been about to say, checking it for the wrong kind of weight. He'd been about to say something about her family's valley, about the surveys being useful beyond Vance's operation, about the possibility that the water rights documentation could serve more than one purpose. It was true, and it was relevant, and it also felt like something he wasn't sure he had the right to offer yet. "When this is done," he said again, More carefully, the surveys might be good for more than stopping Vance. She looked at him. That's your decision, he said. How they get used, and for what, I'm just saying it. Kaya held his eyes for a long moment. Then she looked back at the horses. I know, she said. The coals breathed their last light. Somewhere on the south ridge, a coyote said something to the dark, and then was quiet. The canyon held them in its cooling stone walls, and the horses stood in their paddock, breathing the slow breath of sleep, and two people sat by a fence in the very small hours of the morning, having figured out, without quite saying so, that what was happening between them had moved past debt and past tolerance, and past the careful separate distances of the early days. It was a partnership, built in burned coal and hauled water, and the hard truth of what the other person had done and suffered and was willing to do. Neither of them named it yet. They didn't need to. Holt was coming. There was work to do first. The days after He-Man left had a particular quality to them. Watchful, like the canyon itself was paying attention. Jesse felt it in the way he moved through his morning work. He checked the canyon mouth before he checked the horses. He positioned himself at the forge with the door angled so he could see the south trail without turning. He noted where Kaya was during the day, not out of habit, but out of the calculation of a man who's been in enough bad situations to know that knowing where people are matters when things go wrong fast. Kaya felt it too. He could tell by the way her morning circuit of the property had changed. She was still methodical, still quiet, still gathering and working and maintaining the rhythm they'd built together. But she came back from the scrubland faster now. She stayed closer to the forge during the heat of the day, and twice he'd caught her on the high rock at the canyon's east rim, sitting absolutely still, watching the southern approach through the desert shimmer. They'd worked through He-Man's information together the morning after he left, sitting at the workbench with Jesse's old scouting logs spread out between them. Jesse had opened the steel box without ceremony and pulled the logbooks out and set them on the bench, and let Kaya read them. She read carefully. She ran her finger down the survey lines and the water source notations with the concentration of someone cross-referencing what they know against what they're seeing. At one point, she stopped and was quiet for almost a full minute, her finger resting on a page. Jesse looked at what she was looking at. It was the Eastern Spring notation, the one in the valley, with his handwriting marking the source depth, and the flow rate and the access coordinates. He didn't say anything. After a moment, she turned the page and kept reading. They'd identified 4 points of cross-reference between Jesse's military logs and the original territorial surveys. 4 places where 2 independent documents made by different people, at different times for different purposes, agreed on the same geographic water source. 4 pieces of evidence that, laid against Vance's fraudulent purchase claims and contamination operation, would make a federal case difficult to argue against. Kaya had written the cross-reference points in her own hand on a separate sheet of paper, clean and precise, the way someone writes something they expect to need to present to someone else. She'd folded that sheet and put it with the surveys, wherever the surveys were. Jesse hadn't asked where that was. He trusted the design. 4 days after He-Man rode out, Jesse came back from the west seep with the evening water haul and found Kaya at the paddock fence with her eyes on the south trail. He set the buckets down. He looked south, dust cloud, small but purposeful, moving at a pace that wasn't a drifter's pace or a trader's pace. That was the pace of a group of men who knew where they were going. How many? He said. 5, she said. Maybe 6. Hard to count in the dust. 5 or 6 men coming fast. Holt plus hired guns. Vance's payroll riders, the ones who watched exits. Jesse did a quick count of what he had, his rifle, his revolver, the shotgun on the wall inside the house. He was good with all 3, and he'd been in worse odds before, during the scout years, in situations where the terrain was working against him. But those were different situations. He hadn't been worried about anyone else. Get inside, he said. No, she said. Kaya, If I get inside, I lose my sightlines. She turned to look at him, her face completely steady. I'm better outside. I know where the cover is. You don't need to manage me, Jesse. Tell me what you need. He looked at her for a moment. She was right. She knew this canyon better than the approaching riders did. And she was right that she was a better asset outside with her knowledge of the terrain than she would be sheltered inside waiting. That was a tactical reality, and it sat badly with him, and he accepted it anyway, because the situation didn't care about his preferences. Stay east of the corral, he said. The paddock fence gives you structure, and the canyon wall gives you an exit north, if you need it. If shooting starts and it goes wrong, you go up the east trail and over the second ridge. You know that route. I know it. Take the surveys with you. Whatever happens. She held his eyes. Go get your rifle, she said. They're maybe 20 minutes out. He went. He was at the forge checking the second firing when they came through the canyon mouth. 6 riders. Holt at the front, pale eyes, scanning the property with the professional thoroughness of a man who does this for money and has learned to read a piece of ground quickly. Behind him, 5 men in the posture Heman had described. Riding 2 straight, watching exits. Jesse came out of the forge with his rifle in the crook of his arm. Not raised, not threatening, just present. Holt pulled up 20 yards from the forge and looked at him. McCallum, he said. Holt, Jesse said, you know why I'm here. I know what you're going to say you're here for. Jesse kept his voice level. You settled the court debt. I paid it in front of witnesses. This isn't about the debt. Holt looked around the property with those pale, patient eyes. She's here, I know she is. The woman has documents that belong to Mr. Vance. Property seized in a fraudulent transfer from a legitimate business operation. Their recovery is a legal matter. I don't know anything about documents. McCallum. Holt said it like a period at the end of something. I've got 6 men, and I'm in a good mood right now. That changes if this gets complicated. Jesse looked at the 6 men. He looked at their weapons, their positioning, the way they'd spread slightly without being told to, angling to cover different sight lines across the property. They'd done this before, which meant they were professionals, which meant a direct engagement was a bad idea. He was going to need time and terrain. Let me show you the property, Jesse said. If she's here, you'll find her. I'm not going to die over a woman I cut loose 2 weeks ago. Something flickered in Holt's eyes. Calculation. Jesse kept his face easy and cooperative, and waited. All right, Holt said. Show me. That bought him 6 minutes. He walked Holt and 2 of the riders around the north perimeter of the property, past the storage shed, past the woodpile, past the water access, taking the long way, keeping himself between Holt and the east side, where he'd told Kaya to stay. He answered Holt's questions in the flat, unhurried voice of a man who had nothing to hide, which was a voice he'd learned from an army captain who'd been good at exactly this kind of controlled deception. He heard the horses before Holt did. Not his horses. They were pedant and quiet. These were the other 4 riders who'd been left at the front, moving around the south side of the corral, moving without being told to, on their own initiative, or on a signal he'd missed. They'd split deliberately. Holt had kept him talking in the north, while the other 4 went around the south. Jesse turned. The south side of the corral came into view, around the corner of the forge, and what he saw was Kaya, caught in the open between the paddock fence and the forge wall. 2 of the riders cutting off her north route, and 2 more coming from the south. She had her knife out. That was all she had. Her rifle was in the storage shed, and she hadn't had time to get it. She was looking at him, not asking for rescue, reading the situation, planning. He raised his rifle. Holt's pistol came up at the same instant, pressed to Jesse's shoulder from behind. Easy, Holt said. Jesse went still. Tell her to put the knife down, Holt said. Jesse didn't say anything. One of the riders dismounted and crossed to the forge wall and pulled down the oilcloth that covered the supply stack beside the forge door. Underneath it was the dry wood pile for the forge feed. He pulled it away from the wall, searching for the surveys, looking in obvious places. Another rider kicked open the storage shed. The other two closed in on Kaya. She didn't back up. She held her ground and kept the knife between her and the nearest rider and watched all four of them at once, with the calm, precise attention of someone who is thinking several moves ahead and keeping the calculation off their face. Jesse assessed what he had. Holt's pistol at his shoulder, his rifle at an angle that would take too long to redirect, his revolver on his right hip, but Holt was on his right, and pulling the revolver meant moving into the pistol. 4 men on Kaya, 1 man at the storage shed. That was all 6, which meant he'd been right about the number but wrong about being able to manage the spread. Last time, Holt said, "Tell her." Jesse thought about what Kaya had said about the surveys and their design, that they couldn't be reached without reaching her first. She'd built herself into the protection of the documents. He hadn't understood how completely she meant that until right now. He thought about options. He had 3. None of them were good. The least bad one required him to move into Holt's pistol and hope the angle was survivable, which was the kind of math that a man only did when he'd run out of other math. Then the forge caught, not the fire inside it, the wall outside. The rider who'd pulled down the supply stack and the wood pile hadn't been careful, and one of the dry wood sections had rolled against the forge's side exhaust vent, where the metal ran hot, even banked. And the dry wood was touching hot iron, and the result was inevitable. It was small at first, a curl of smoke, then a lick of flame at the base of the forge wall. The rider saw it and stepped back. The wood pile was stacked against the forge all the way to the roof overhang of the attached lean-to. If the lean-to caught, the lean-to's roof connected to the main forge structure, and the main forge structure had 14 months of embedded coal dust and oil in its wooden frame elements, and it would go fast. Jesse knew all of this in about 1 second. Holt knew it too. He glanced at the smoke and his attention shifted, just slightly, just for a moment. Jesse moved. He drove his elbow back hard into Holt's gun arm and took 1 step forward and turned and put his rifle up, and Holt fired, and the shot went wide. And then they were in close, and the rifle was no good for close, and Jesse dropped it and had his revolver out, and they were pressed against each other in the space between wanting to shoot and not having enough room to do it safely. The rider at the shed was running toward the fire. Kaya moved. Jesse couldn't see what she did exactly. He was occupied with Holt, with the muscle and the grip and the particular ugly work of close quarters fighting, which is less like the stories make it, and more like 2 men trying to control a single piece of ground. But he heard one of the riders shout and heard the impact of something physical, and when he got Holt's gun arm twisted to a bad angle and forced him back 2 steps and looked, one of the 4 men was on the ground, and Kaya had his rifle, and she had it pointed at the other 3, and her face was absolutely still. 3 men assessed her and the rifle, and didn't move. The forge wall was burning properly now. The lean-to overhang had caught, and the fire was moving fast up the dry wood under the roofline. That quick, greedy move that fire makes when it finds material that's been waiting for it. Holt had stopped struggling. He was looking at the fire, too. Jesse had both hands on Holt's gun arm, and Holt was calculating the same things. Jesse was calculating the fire, the positions, the options. Then the roof timber went. Jesse heard it before he understood what it was. A crack, sharp and decisive, from inside the forge. The lean-to overhang had burned through at the junction, with the forge wall and the main roof timber was taking the load without support, and the weight of the stone cladding on the roof was more than an unsupported timber was designed to handle. He heard it. He registered it. He did not move fast enough. The wall of the forge blew outward in a rush of heat, and the roof section came down, and Jesse was at the wrong angle, and the timber caught his left leg below the knee and pinned it, and then the fire was everywhere around him, and the heat was enormous, and he was on the ground. He could see the sky above the burning forge wall, orange and black and rolling. He could feel the timber on his leg. He pushed at it. It didn't move. It was heavy in the specific, complete way of something that has the whole weight of a structure behind it. And it was hot, and the fire around it was moving toward him with the same patient greed it had shown all along. He could hear Holt shouting orders somewhere outside his field of vision. He pushed at the timber again. His revolver was somewhere under him. He couldn't feel his left foot, and he didn't know if that was the shock or the weight or something worse. Kaya appeared in the gap in the forge wall. She was covered in dust, and her left sleeve was torn, and there was blood on her forearm. But her eyes were clear, and she was looking at the timber, and then at him, and then at the fire moving toward both of them. She ran in. She grabbed the timber with both hands and pulled. It moved an inch and then stopped. "It's pinned on the north end," Jesse said. His voice came out steady, which surprised him, caught on the anvil block. She looked north. She went to the anvil block end and pushed the timber, shifting the angle, and Jesse felt the weight redistribute and pulled his leg, and it came free, and he got one knee under him. "Up," she said, and she had his arm, and she was pulling, and he was pushing, and then he was upright. And the forge was actively collapsing on the north end, the back wall coming down in stages. They went through the gap in the south wall, outside into the orange-lit evening. Holt and his men were regrouped at the edge of the corral. Holt was on his horse. He'd reclaimed control while Jesse was under the timber. 3 of his men were mounted. The one Kaya had taken down was standing, limping slightly. The rider at the storage shed was back with the group. Holt looked at Jesse on one leg, holding himself up against the forge's exterior wall. He looked at Kaya with the stolen rifle. He looked at the burning forge. He assessed the situation with his pale, professional eyes. "This isn't finished," he said. "No," Jesse said. "It isn't." Holt's eyes moved to Kaya. "The surveys," he said. "You know what Mr. Vance will accept." Kaya looked at him. She looked at him with the same absolute stillness she'd shown on the auction crate in Bitterwell. Except now she had a rifle, and her feet were on ground she knew. "What she said next," she said quietly. She said it without drama, without anger, without anything except the absolute clarity of someone who has made a decision and is at complete peace with it. She said, "Tell Vance to get a lawyer who knows water law. He's going to need one." Holt looked at her for a long moment. Jesse held himself up against the wall and looked at Holt. The fire behind them popped and cracked as the forge finished what it had started. Then Holt reached into his coat. He produced a set of iron manacles. He turned them over in his hand the way a man turns over a coin he's deciding whether to spend. He looked at the situation. Kaya with a rifle. Jesse injured, but upright. The fire consuming the forge behind them. The horses in the paddock untouched. 6 men against 2 people who had just survived a building collapse and were still standing. The calculation came out, the way Holt decided it came out, which wasn't necessarily logic. It was what Holt wanted it to be. Jesse knew, looking at those pale eyes, that what Holt wanted was for this to be over for tonight, with something he could bring back to Vance. Not the surveys. The surveys were hidden, and he knew it. But something. Jesse looked at Kaya. She was already looking at him. He saw it happening in her face before it happened. The decision forming, working through all its stages, arriving at itself with the specific quality of a thing that is freely chosen, even though it's terrible. She was looking at the timber mark on his leg. She was looking at the fire. She was running the same arithmetic that Jesse was running. The arithmetic of what it cost to keep fighting tonight versus what it cost to stop tonight and fight differently tomorrow. She lowered the rifle. "Holt," she said. Holt looked at her. "The irrigation sluice," she said. "On the south channel. Open it. Full flow. Directed at the forge structure." She held up the folded survey pages where she'd had them tucked inside her shirt. "You open the sluice and I'll walk with you." Holt looked at the surveys. "And if I just take you?" he said. "Then Jesse Burns," she said. "And I make sure you never find the originals. These are copies. The originals are somewhere. You'll never look without me." The fire ate another section of roof. Jesse pushed himself upright fully. taking the weight on his right leg, and looked at Holt and said nothing. Because there was nothing to say that Kaya hadn't already said, and she was the one making this decision, and the decision was hers. Holt nodded at one of his riders. The rider went to the sluice gate on the south channel. The water came. It wasn't enough to stop the fire entirely, but it hit the burning structure with enough force to drive the fire back from Jesse, to soak the ground between him and the worst of the heat, to create the margin between survivable and not. Holt snapped the manacles onto Kaya's wrists. She looked at Jesse once. He was looking back at her. His leg was bad, and the fire was still burning behind him, and he was standing on the wet ground with his hands at his sides and his eyes on her face. She let Holt put her on the front of his horse. She did not look away from Jesse until the horse turned. Holt rode south with his men. The fire finished with the forge. Jesse stood in the wet ash and the dark and heard his own name in his voice before he knew he was going to say it. Not her name. His own. The name of a man who was still standing when he shouldn't have been, on a leg that would need looking at, in the ruins of everything he'd built in the canyon. Except the horses were alive, and the surveys were somewhere. Holt didn't know. And Kaya had told him exactly what she'd done with both of those facts with one look before she let the manacles close. He sat down in the wet dirt because his legs said it was time. He sat there in the smoke and the dark, and he started thinking about what came next. Heman came back 2 days later. He smelled the smoke before he saw the canyon, that particular char of burned structure that hangs in desert air longer than it has any right to. By the time his gray mule came through the canyon mouth, he'd already worked out that something serious had happened. And when he saw the forge, the blackened stone walls, and the collapsed roof, and the ash pile that had been a lean-to, he pulled up and sat very still for a moment. Then he saw Jesse at the corral fence and rode toward him. Jesse was standing, which was more than he'd managed for most of the first day. His left leg was wrapped from the knee down in a tight bandage, strips of canvas soaked in the desert willow preparation that Kaya had taught him, the anti-inflammatory properties of the bark doing real work on the swelling. He'd set the leg himself, which had been one of the worst experiences of his recent life, bracing it against the paddock post and working by feel and lamplight. Nothing was broken. The timber had pinned the muscle and bruised the bone, and it would be another week before he could put full weight on it without serious pain. But it was whole. He'd been getting around with a fence post as a crutch. Heman dismounted and looked at the forge ruins, and then at Jesse's leg, and then at Jesse's face, which had the particular quality of a man who has been up for a long time working on a problem. "Tell me," Heman said. Jesse told him. He told it plain, and in order, the way he'd been organizing it in his head for 2 days. Holt's arrival, the gunfight, the fire, the timber, Kaya's decision, the manacles, the sluice. Holt riding south. Heman listened without interrupting. When Jesse finished, Heman was quiet for a moment. "She walked into the chains to put the water on the fire," Heman said. "Yes, to keep you from burning." "Yes." Heman looked at the ruins of the forge. He looked at the sluice gate, which Jesse had closed after the fire was done, but which still had the wet earth around it from the flow. He took his hat off and held it in both hands. "When do you want to leave?" he said. Jesse had been expecting that question. He'd been expecting it from the moment he'd sat down in the wet ash 2 nights ago and started thinking. "Tomorrow morning," Jesse said. "I needed a day to get the leg workable and a day to sort the horses. The horses are sorted. 15 of the 17 are fine. The 2 younger ones I kept separate, the ones showing the early contamination signs. They've been on the West Seep water since, and they're improving. I've arranged with the Portillo family at the north edge of the canyon to board all 17 through the winter, if needed. I rode out there yesterday." He looked at the crutch post. "Took most of the day." Heman looked at the leg. "You rode to the Portillo place yesterday on that leg." "I didn't say it was comfortable." Heman put his hat back on. He had the expression of a man who is not surprised, but is still taking the full measure of what he's seeing. All right, he said. What do you need from me? Two things. I need you to ride to Marshal Thorne's district office and tell him what I've told you. The contamination, the surveys, Vance, all of it. Don't wait for me. Go now and get it in front of him. Get his attention on it before Vance can get his lawyers building a wall around the situation. And the second thing, tell me anything you know about where Vance runs his operations north of the basin. Any kind of facility, a mine, a camp, somewhere with security and space to hold someone. He-Man thought about this. There's an old silver operation north of Bitterwell, Silver Creek, played out 15 years ago. There's been talk of Vance using it for some kind of storage or processing. Nothing confirmed. How far north of Bitterwell? Maybe 12 miles. Canyon approach. Controlled entrance. If you wanted to hold someone without it, looking like what it was, that'd be the place. Jesse turned that information over, checking it against what he knew about the terrain north of Bitterwell, working out routes, access, sight lines. That's where she is, he said. Heman looked at him for a long moment. You're going up there? Yes, on that leg. The leg is going to have to manage. He-Man sat down on the upturned bucket near the paddock gate with the deliberate movement of a man who has something to say and wants to be sitting when he says it. He put his hands on his knees. Jesse, he said, there are 6 men minimum. Holt, Vance's payroll riders. If Vance himself is at the Silver Creek site, that number goes up. I know. You and that fence post against 6 armed men. I won't have the fence post by then, Jesse said. I'll have a rifle and a revolver, and I'll have 2 days to rest the leg before I ride, and I'll have whatever Kaya's managed to set up on her end. Heman looked at him sharply. What does that mean? It means she's not going to sit in a cell and wait for me to show up, Jesse said. She's not built that way. Whatever situation Holt puts her in, she's going to be working it from the inside the entire time. When I get there, things will already be moving. My job is to show up when they're moving. Heman was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You're not going out there to rescue a helpless victim. Jesse looked at him. No, Jesse said. I'm going to stand shoulder to shoulder with an equal. Heman held his eyes. Then he nodded. Once, the way a man nods when something he's heard confirms something he already believed. He stood up from the bucket. I'll ride to Thorne's office today. I'll tell him everything. Tell him about the military survey logs, too. I'm bringing them with me. Where are they? Tucked under Dust's saddle pad. I didn't trust leaving them in the house while I was riding to Portillo's. Heman looked at him. You hid the survey logs under the saddle pad of a horse. Holt's men already searched the house and the shed, Jesse said. They didn't search the horses. Heman was quiet for a second. That's actually sensible. I've had 2 days to think. He packed that afternoon. It was not an elaborate operation. He'd done enough trail packing in his scout years to know that weight was the enemy of speed, and that speed was what the next few days would require. He took his rifle, his revolver, his skinning knife, and the short-barreled shotgun from the house wall. He took ammunition, enough for a sustained engagement, but not so much it slowed him. He took his traveling kit, coffee and dried meat and hard biscuit, enough for 3 days. He took the military survey logs. He took the medicinal preparation Kaya had made for his leg, the remaining desert willow bark, and the set of clean bandages from the first aid supplies in the house, because his leg was going to need attention, and he couldn't count on anyone else being able to give it. He took one other thing. In the ruins of the forge, under the collapsed east wall, there was a fireproof box he'd built into the stone foundation 3 years ago. He'd built it with the blacksmith's understanding of what fire does to different materials, what survives, and what doesn't. The box was stone enclosed, iron sealed, and when he pried it out of the ash and ash-cooled debris on the afternoon of the first day, it was intact. Inside was money. His emergency reserve, 6 months of small savings in coin and small bills, the kind of fund a man in the canyon country keeps, because the nearest bank is 4 hours away, and emergencies don't wait for banking hours. He put the money in his coat pocket. He also pulled out the brass cavalry insignia. He looked at it for a moment. The chevron and crossed sabers. The regiment number. The thing that had been on Kaya's face when she'd found it in the toolbox. He put it in his shirt pocket next to his chest. Not as a badge, as a reminder of what he owed and what he was riding toward. The first morning on the trail, he found the marks. He'd taken the southern route, out of the canyon, the same direction Holt had ridden, because that was the route to Bitterwell, and through Bitterwell to Silver Creek. The trail was hard-packed and rocky coming out of the canyon mouth, and then it opened into the flat, reddish scrubland that stretched south for miles. He was maybe 3 hours out when he saw the first one, on a red rock face beside the trail. Low, at about knee height for someone on foot, or eye height for someone looking from the ground. A small mark scratched into the rock with something sharp, not random, botanical. The outline of a specific plant, a 3-lobed leaf with a distinctive notch at the stem, and beside it an arrow pointing east. Jesse pulled his horse up and looked at it. The mark was fresh. The scratch was pale against the weathered red of the rock, which meant it hadn't had time to darken. It had been made within the last 2 days. Holt's group had passed this way. Someone in that group had been at ground level, close to the rock face, with something sharp, the iron chain link. Jesse thought about the iron manacles and the short chain between them, and about a woman whose hands were never idle and whose mind was always working, and he thought about what you could scratch into soft sandstone with a sharp iron edge if you had your hands bound in front of you, and you were passing low rock faces on the back of a horse. The 3-lobed leaf with the notch at the stem. He looked at it carefully. He'd seen that plant. Kaya had shown it to him in the scrubland the first week, pulled up a sample and explained its properties. Desert dock. It grew in the canyon country in specific conditions, near seasonal water seeps, in the shelter of larger rock formations. She wasn't marking a plant. She was marking a water source, telling him where the water was along this route, and the arrow pointing east. He turned his horse east and rode for half a mile, and found a shallow seasonal creek, half-dried, but still running clear in the lowest section. He watered the horse and filled his canteen and sat for a moment in the shade of the overhang. She'd known he'd come. She'd known he'd take this route. She'd known what he'd need along the way, and she'd built a signpost for him with the materials she had available. 2 days into captivity, and she was already working. He found 4 more marks over the next 2 days. Each one was botanical, specific to plants she'd shown him or mentioned in their conversations, and each one had directional or informational elements that only made sense to someone who'd spent 6 weeks learning the desert with her. A juniper sprig outline with a symbol he recognized from her water testing work, pointing to a place where the trail forked, and the right fork looked shorter but wasn't safe. A cholla cactus mark at a curve in the red rocks, with 3 scratches beneath it, which he read as 3 riders watching the north approach, which turned out to be correct when he scouted the next rise carefully and saw Holt's men on patrol at the canyon entrance. She was reading the terrain and leaving him a map, an encrypted map in a language that was only legible to him. He rode carefully and slept lightly and kept the leg bound tight and kept his eyes on the rock faces. By the end of the second day, he was in the low hills north of Bitterwell, close enough to see the town's smoke smear on the southern horizon when he climbed to a high point. Ahead, another 6 or 7 miles north, the terrain changed character. Harder rock, deeper canyon cuts, the kind of country that old mining operations favored because the ore veins ran in the hard rock and the canyon walls gave you natural security. He made a cold camp in a rock shelter at the second hill's base. No fire. He ate dried meat and hard biscuit and drank cold water from the canteen Kaya had pointed him toward 2 days ago, and he attended to his leg in the gathering dark. The swelling was holding. The pain was significant but located, which was better than diffuse pain, which usually meant something moving around that shouldn't be. He unwrapped the bandage and rewrapped it tighter, added a fresh application of the desert willow preparation, and sat with the leg elevated against his saddle for an hour while he thought. Silver Creek, 12 miles north of Bitter Well, which put it 4 or 5 miles from where he was sitting. Canyon approach, controlled entrance. Heman had said it was an old silver operation, which meant underground workings, tunnels, shoring timber, or processing facilities above ground. If Vance had repurposed it, he'd have turned some of the above-ground structures into habitation and storage, and the underground levels were perfect for holding people you didn't want anyone seeing. He thought about the marks on the red rocks and what they told him about how Kaya's mind was working. She was organized. She was communicating. She was observing her environment and building knowledge of it in the way of someone who is preparing for action rather than waiting for rescue. He thought about what she'd said in the forge. What Holt could lock around wrists, what he couldn't touch. He ate the last of the hard biscuit and looked at the stars for a while, and then rolled his coat under his head and slept. At some point in the night, a coyote passed near the rock shelter, paused, and moved on, which meant the area around him was quiet enough for wildlife to move normally. That was good information. He noted it without waking fully and went back under. He woke before dawn and was moving before. The light was good enough to read by, navigating by the terrain he'd studied, and the directions scratched into red rock by a woman who had trusted him to come and known how to make sure he arrived correctly. 2 miles out from what he estimated as the Silver Creek position, he found the last mark. It was on a boulder at a trail junction, higher than the others, at chest height rather than knee height. She'd had a reason for that. Higher marks were visible from horseback, which meant it was meant to be read while moving, not while stopped. The mark was different from the others. Not a plant outline. It was a rough sketch, angular, and quick but precise. The kind of drawing a person makes when they have limited time and a clear picture in their head. It showed a canyon outline with what were clearly 2 entrances, a main one and a secondary. The secondary marked with the juniper symbol she'd used before, which he'd come to understand meant safe water and safe approach. Below the secondary entrance mark was a single symbol, a circle with a horizontal line through it. He'd seen that symbol once, in the canyon, on a piece of bark she'd been using to grind herbs. She'd explained it when he'd asked. It was a notation from the mission school, a cartographic symbol for a point of observation, a place where you could see without being seen. She was telling him where to position himself. She was telling him when, or rather, she was telling him to wait for the right moment, which meant she had a moment in mind. Jesse sat on his horse at the boulder junction in the early morning, the sky going from black to deep blue above the canyon walls, and he looked at the sketch on the rock. She'd been planning this since they put her in the irons. She'd been studying the Silver Creek site, observing the patterns, identifying the secondary entrance, preparing whatever she was going to prepare inside. He wasn't riding into a rescue operation. He was riding into a coordinated action with someone who had been working her end of it for 2 days already. He tucked that into his chest alongside the cavalry insignia and rode for the secondary entrance. He found it in the first good light of morning, a crack in the canyon wall that had been used by the original mining operation as a secondary ore cart exit. It was narrow and overgrown and not visible from the main approach, and it opened onto a ledge above the Silver Creek site that gave him exactly what the symbol on the rock had promised. He could see without being seen. He tied his horse back in the crack, where it couldn't be seen from below, and crawled out onto the ledge on his belly, the rifle beside him, and looked down at Silver Creek. It was bigger than he'd imagined. Vance had done real work on it. The above-ground structures were repaired and expanded, and there was a central yard between the processing building and what looked like a converted bunkhouse. There were guards on rotation. He counted their movements, 2 on the main entrance, 1 at the bunkhouse corner, one on the elevated walkway that connected the processing building to the main structure. 4 visible guards. Holt was presumably somewhere inside. The bunkhouse had small barred windows on the south face. He studied them with the patience of a man who has done observation work before and knows that the thing you're looking for appears in its own time. On the third pass of his eyes across the bunkhouse windows, he saw movement in the second window from the east end. A hand, briefly visible. Gone. Then again, more deliberately. Not waving. Arranged. Fingers spread in a specific configuration that he recognized because she'd used it once in the canyon when she was explaining how desert plants signaled water availability to people who knew how to read them. It meant ready. Jesse pressed his cheek against the cold stone of the ledge and allowed himself one moment of something that wasn't quite relief, but was adjacent to it. She was ready. He checked his rifle and his revolver and looked at the guard rotation patterns he'd been memorizing. For the last 20 minutes, he was ready too. Down in the Silver Creek yard, the morning was getting bright. The guards were changing shift. The moment when the patterns were loosest, when the departing guard had moved and the arriving guard hadn't settled yet, that was going to be the window. Jessie watched and counted and waited. She'd done her part. She'd led him here through the desert, using iron and rock and plant knowledge and the specific vocabulary of 6 weeks of shared ground. She'd told him what she needed and where she'd be and what she was preparing. He wasn't going in to save her. He was going in to be there when she moved. He put his eye to the rifle sights and watched the yard and breathed steadily. The sun came fully over the canyon wall. It was time. The cell was 12 feet by 8. Kaya had measured it the first hour, walking the perimeter in the dark with her hands trailing the wall, counting her steps, mapping the dimensions the way she'd been taught, to map any new space. You learn a place before you need to move through it fast. That was the rule. Her grandmother had said it about the desert, and it was just as true about a room with a locked door. The floor was hard-packed dirt. The walls were rough stone, original mine construction, mortared badly in places, and solid in others. The barred window on the south face was 18 inches wide and 12 inches tall, too small to exit, but large enough to read the yard through, which was its own kind of useful. The door was iron-banded timber, locked from outside with a hasp and padlock. The padlock was a good one. She'd felt the mechanism through the gap in the door on the first night, and knew it wasn't something that could be finessed with a hairpin, which she didn't have anyway. The hasp screws, on the other hand, were old, and had been going soft in the stone frame for years. She'd checked them the same night. 4 screws, 2 compromised. She filed that away and did nothing about it yet. Patience was a skill. Her father had called it the most undervalued survival tool in the desert, because people in trouble always wanted to move, and the desert rewarded stillness. You watch before you walk. You learn before you act. You build your knowledge, and you wait for the right conditions. She had time. She intended to use all of it. The manacles were still on her wrists on the first morning. Holt had left them on through the night, which told her he was cautious about her in close quarters, which was information. Caution meant he'd seen something in her that warranted it. She kept her expression neutral and her movements small and predictable, doing nothing to revise his caution upward, but nothing to let him think it was unnecessary. On the second morning, a guard brought a tin plate of beans and cornbread and set it inside the door. He was young, maybe 20, and he set the plate down with the slightly uncomfortable posture of someone who hadn't done this kind of work long enough to be indifferent to it. She thanked him, politely, without warmth or calculation in her voice. Just manners, the basic human courtesy that her mother had insisted on regardless of circumstances. He blinked. Then he nodded and left. She ate the beans and set the plate aside and looked at the cornbread. The cornbread had a specific texture, slightly gummy at the center. She pinched a piece of the center and rolled it between her fingers. It held together well, stiff enough to hold a shape. She thought about that and began planning. The Silver Creek site held more than guards and locked doors. She'd understood that within the first day, reading the sounds and movements through her barred window, the way her grandmother had taught her to read the desert, by sustained, patient attention to what was actually present rather than what you expected to find. There were workers here, not Vance's men. Workers. She could hear them in the structure above the cell level, the particular rhythm of enforced labor, movement without choice, the sounds of people doing physical work under direction rather than of their own will. In the evening, she could hear voices, more than the 4 or 5 guards would account for. Voices in at least 3 languages. Spanish and something she thought was Tohono O'odham, and English, with the accent of men who'd come from somewhere else, hoping for something better. Migrant workers. Possibly others. She thought about that through the second night. By the third morning, she had what she needed to start moving. The young guard came with breakfast again. This time she was sitting against the east wall, working at a piece of loose thread from her sleeve hem, apparently doing nothing useful. She looked up when he came in. "What's your name?" she said. He hesitated. "Why?" "Because I've been talking to the wall for 2 days," she said. "And the wall doesn't tell me its name either." Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile. "Colm," he said. "Colm Reedy." "Colm Reedy," she said. "How long have you been at Silver Creek?" 4 months. "And before that?" "Trailing cattle." "Sonora." He set the plate down with less awkwardness than before. "Before that, my family's farm in Missouri." "What brought you here?" He looked at her with the expression of someone who's been asked a question that has an answer he doesn't want to say out loud. "Work," he said, and left it there. She nodded. She let that sit without pressing it the way you let a wire go slack before you use it. "Colm," she said, as he turned to go. "The men working the upper level, the ones I can hear at night. Are they paid?" His hand was on the door. He didn't turn around for a moment. "Then Mr. Vance says the debt gets worked off." "Whose debt?" "Silence, thank you, Colm," she said. He left. She ate her breakfast and thought about Colm Reedy from Missouri, and about the particular discomfort in his posture every time he set the plate down, and about what it meant that a young man from a farm could find himself 4 months into a job that required him to bring food to a woman in a locked cell, and tell himself it was work. She thought about the workers upstairs. She started making a plan. The nightshade grew in the shade of the South Canyon wall, visible through her barred window, about 30 yards from the bunkhouse. She'd seen it on the first day, those distinctive dark berries against the pale stone, and she'd noted it, the way she noted everything, without urgency, filing it for later. It wasn't useful in large quantities. Even small amounts produced symptoms: nausea, disorientation, a heavy lassitude in the limbs. Nothing life-threatening at the right dose, but enough to incapacitate a man for several hours, without leaving a mark anyone could point to. The problem was getting to it. She worked on that problem through the third day. Colm came with the midday meal. She'd been watching the window in the morning, and she'd seen the cook fire in the yard and the large pot that one of the guards stirred for 20 minutes before the meal distribution. Every meal came from that pot. All the guards ate from it. The workers ate from it. Everyone at Silver Creek ate from the same source. Everything she needed was in that sequence of observations. She waited until the 4th day. On the 4th morning, she told Colm she wasn't feeling well. She said it, without drama, holding her stomach, looking pale in the way that comes naturally to someone who's been sleeping on dirt for 4 days and eating cornbread with questionable water. She asked if she could get some fresh air in the yard, briefly, with an escort. She pointed out that a sick prisoner was a management problem. He didn't want to explain to Holt. Colm thought about this for the length of time it took him to decide that she was right. He brought her to the yard for 15 minutes. It was enough. The south wall of the canyon was in shadow in the morning, and the nightshade was in that shadow, and she gathered what she gathered, while Colm watched the main entrance with his back partly turned, because he was 20, and had been on a farm in Missouri, and had not been trained in the specific vigilance that his current job required. She was back in her cell with what she needed before the 15 minutes were up. The cook fire in the yard was unattended for about 40 minutes each afternoon, while the cook went to collect the evening water supply from the holding tank on the north side of the structure. Kaya knew this because she'd been watching the yard through her window every afternoon for 4 days. Not staring, glancing naturally, the way anyone looks out a window without purpose, while actually counting the minutes. 40 minutes. The pot sat on the fire, simmering, tended by no one. On the morning of the 5th day, she ground what she'd gathered into the cornbread mixture from her plate with the methodical precision of someone who has done this kind of work with plants many times. She knew the concentration. She knew the effect. She used the minimum amount necessary to produce the result she needed without producing anything worse. She knew how to do this because her grandmother had spent years teaching her the properties of desert plants, the healing applications, and the harmful ones, and the crucial difference between the two, which was mostly dosage and context. Knowledge is neutral. A plant that treats inflammation at one concentration and causes harm at another is the same plant. The skill is in understanding where the lines are. She gave Colm the cornbread, not directly. She put it on the plate from her morning meal, returned it to the side of the door, and told him she wasn't hungry and didn't want it to waste. She said it in the voice of a woman who was still not feeling well and had no appetite. She said it looking at the opposite wall, not at him. He took the plate. She waited. While she waited, she worked on the hasp screws. She'd been working on them every night, using the iron chain link the way she'd used it on the red rocks on the trail out of the canyon. The link had a sharp corner at its weld point, not quite a tool, but close enough for soft iron and old mortar. Each night she gave the 2 compromised screws a quarter turn. She felt the resistance decreasing incrementally, the way you feel the looseness coming into a joint before it lets go. By the 5th night, the 2 screws were finger loose. The other 2 were still solid, and she had nothing to cut the hasp itself. She didn't need to cut it. She needed the door to open, and the hasp didn't need to fail completely if the lock side of the frame was the weak point. She'd been feeling the gap at the lock side edge of the door on her nightly rounds. The frame was warped slightly from years of heat and cold in the canyon rock. The door didn't sit true in the frame. With 2 hasp screws loose and the frame warped at the lock side, enough sustained lateral pressure on the correct angle would peel the door open without breaking anything. She'd tested this theory carefully each night. A few pounds of force, just enough to feel the give without producing sound. The door was ready. She was waiting for the right moment. On the morning of the 5th day, she found the other prisoners. She'd been hearing them, but locating them exactly required a different kind of listening, patient and directional, her ear against specific walls at specific times. By mid-morning, she'd identified the adjacent cell, separated from hers by the stone wall on the north face, and she'd identified the occupied structure above her, the level where the migrant workers were kept at night after their labor shifts ended. She began talking through the wall. Not loudly. She kept her voice at the level of someone talking in their sleep. Almost nothing. Just enough to carry through the mortar gaps in the worst bonded section of the north wall. She spoke in Spanish first, then in the few words of Tohono O'odham she knew from her childhood, then in English. On the 3rd attempt, someone answered. A woman's voice. Low, careful, positioned right at the wall on the other side. Her name was Petra. She'd been at Silver Creek for 3 months. She'd come north from Sonora with her brother, looking for the mining work that Vance's recruiters had advertised in the border towns. Good wages, steady work, 3 months to start. The wages had never materialized. The 3 months had become indefinite. Her brother was working the upper level. They were told their transport costs were still being worked off. The debt that Colm Reedy couldn't say out loud Kaya listened to all of this through 2 inches of stone. She asked questions, carefully, learning what Petra knew about the structure, the guard schedules, the layout of the levels above them. Petra had been in the cell for a week. Before the cell, she'd been in the worker bunkhouse, which meant she knew the above-ground layout in detail. Kaya learned the layout. Then she told Petra what she was going to do. Petra was quiet for a moment. "When?" she said. "When the time is right," Kaya said. "You'll know. When you hear it start, get everyone moving toward the main yard entrance. Don't wait. Don't look for me. Move. How will we know?" Kaya thought about Jesse on the ledge above the secondary entrance. She thought about the hand signals she'd made through the window that morning, the spread finger configuration she'd used in the canyon when she was showing him desert plant patterns, the one that meant something was organized and functional and present. She'd seen him. She'd seen the rifle barrel at the ledge edge, dark against the pale stone, barely visible, present. He was there. He was watching. He'd come on a bad leg through 2 days of desert trail, following marks she'd scratched in red rock, and he was on the ledge above the secondary entrance with his eye on the yard. And he was ready. She felt the certainty of that settle through her like water into dry ground. Not surprise. She'd known he'd come. She'd built the trail for him specifically because she'd known it. The knowing and the seeing it confirmed were different things, though. The seeing it confirmed was its own thing, solid in a way the knowing wasn't quite. She pressed her ear back to the wall. "You'll know," she said again. "When it starts, move fast and stay low. Tell the others now so they're ready. Don't tell the guards." "There's a man," Petra said. "Garcia. He's been here the longest. He knows everyone up there. If you tell me to tell him, he'll have them ready. Tell him." That afternoon, the cook pot sat unattended for 40 minutes. Kaya watched through the window. At the 30-minute mark, 2 of the 4 guards were at the main entrance. The one on the elevated walkway was at the far end, looking north. The 4th one, the one who normally circled the bunkhouse corner, had gone inside the processing building 10 minutes earlier and hadn't come back out yet. This was the best window she'd had in 5 days. She went to the door. The 2 loose screws came out with her fingers in about 20 seconds. She dropped them in her pocket because they were iron, and iron was useful. The hasp held on its remaining 2 screws, but the frame was warped, and she put her shoulder into the door at the angle she'd calculated and pressed. The door moved. It didn't swing open. It peeled, the frame giving at the lock side, the gap widening slowly under sustained pressure, 2 inches, and then 4, and then enough. She was through in about 8 seconds. The corridor was dim and empty. Stone walls, a low timber ceiling, 2 oil lamps at intervals that she'd seen lit at night through the door gap. No guards visible. She moved. She knew where the kitchen area was from Petra's description. Ground level, north side, adjacent to the cook fire access. She went there quickly, her footsteps silent on the hard dirt, keeping to the wall. The kitchen was empty. The cook's water collection took most of an hour when you counted the walking distance to the holding tank and back. She had time. Not a lot of it. The pot of evening stew was simmering on the indoor hearth, staying warm between the outdoor cook fire session and the serving time. She added what she'd prepared to the pot. The right amount, not too much. She stirred it in thoroughly with the long iron spoon and set the spoon back exactly where it had been. Then she went back down the corridor toward her cell. She didn't go back inside. Petra's wall was 6 feet from her cell door. She put her ear to the stone. "Petra," she said, barely above a breath, "a shift on the other side." "Here." "Tonight," Kaya said, "after the evening meal, when the guards are at their lowest, an hour past full dark." "Garcia knows," Petra said. "Good." Kaya stepped back from the wall. "When it starts, you remember what I said." She went to the storeroom Petra had described, 3 doors down the corridor, and found what she'd been looking for. Tools. A silver mine required tools, and old ones got stored rather than discarded because iron in the canyon country was never worthless. She found a sledgehammer with a cracked handle, that had been wound with wire to hold it together. She picked it up, tested the balance. It would do. She carried it back to the corridor and settled in to wait. It was 2 hours before the effects of the nightshade became visible in the guards. She could track it through sound. The guard on the elevated walkway stopped his regular movement pattern at what she estimated was an hour after the evening meal. He sat down. She heard the scrape of him lowering himself against the railing, the lack of subsequent movement. The guard at the main entrance was quieter, but the quality of his silence changed, from the alert quiet of a man standing watch to the slack quiet of a man fighting to keep his eyes open. Not unconscious. She hadn't used that much. Slowed. Dull. The kind of impairment that made a man feel as though the ground was slightly unsteady and his hands were farther from his body than usual. She heard Holt's voice inside the main structure. He hadn't eaten from the yard pot. She'd known there was a risk of that. Holt taking his meals separately, maintaining his own standards. He was unaffected. That was a variable she'd accepted. One fully functional threat. 2 impaired guards. The 4th man she'd lost track of was a variable too. She accepted that as well and moved. She came out of the corridor into the main yard at the moment when the night was darkest, the moon down and the stars not yet at their full brightness. She crossed the yard at a controlled pace, not running, because running attracted attention, and she wasn't at the phase where attention was useful yet. The cell block that held Petra and the other workers was on the east side of the main yard. Iron door, iron locks. The locks were newer than the ones on her cell. The hasp screw approach wasn't going to work. She didn't need it to. She raised the sledgehammer. The padlock on the first door took 2 full swings to break. The sound of it was enormous in the night air, and she didn't try to soften it because there was no softening a sledgehammer, and she didn't need quiet anymore. She needed speed. She moved to the second door. 1 swing. The third door. 2 swings. She was working down the line of cell doors, breaking locks, pulling doors open, and from inside the cells she heard movement and voices, and people getting to their feet, the sounds of people who'd been waiting and who moved with the efficiency of people who'd been told what to do and had been ready for the signal. Petra appeared in the second doorway. Behind her, more people. 7, 8, 10, a dozen. Main yard entrance, Kaya said. Move now. Low and fast. Petra grabbed the woman beside her, and they went. From the elevated walkway, a shout. The impaired guard had found enough function to register the noise, not enough to coordinate a response. He was trying to stand. From inside the main structure, Holt's voice, louder now, calling for the others. Kaya went to the next door. She was working on the 4th door when she heard the shot from above. Not from below. From above. From the secondary entrance ledge. Jesse. He was firing at the elevated walkway, not at the guard. At the lamp on the post beside the walkway, and the lamp went dark, taking out the yard's best light source, giving the people streaming across the yard from the cell block the cover of shadow. Kaya hit the 4th door. It opened, and more people came out. A man she assumed was Garcia because he immediately turned and began directing the others with the quiet authority of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this. Low voices in Spanish, hands on shoulders, people moving toward the yard entrance in a controlled stream rather than a panicked scatter. She moved to the 5th door, and she said it to them as they came out, to the ones close enough to hear, to the woman who was helping an older man to his feet, to the 2 young men who came out with their fists up, ready to fight someone, to all of them, because it needed saying out loud. They can lock iron around our wrists, she said, clear and steady in the dark, but our dignity and self-determination remain ours until we surrender them willingly. She'd said it to herself, at the auction crate in Bitter Well. She'd said it through the stone wall to Petra. She said it now, because the people coming out of those cells needed to hear that what had been taken from them was circumstantial and external and temporary, that the essential thing, the part that was theirs, had never been reached. The older man straightened up when he heard it. Garcia looked at her and nodded. The fifth door was the last one. She swung the sledgehammer, and it opened and 4 people came out, and the last one, a young woman who might have been 16, looked at Kaya with eyes that were full of something complicated and moved past her toward the yard entrance. Kaya let the sledgehammer rest against her leg. Above the secondary entrance, 2 more shots from Jesse's rifle. Not aimed at people, aimed at the second yard lamp. The yard went darker. She heard Holt's boots on the stone floor of the main structure, moving fast toward the yard door. She picked the sledgehammer back up. She was not done yet. But the cell block was empty. The doors were open, and 15 people were moving through the dark yard toward the entrance that Jesse was covering from above, moving with the particular speed and purpose of people who have remembered that their legs work and their choices are their own. Kaya watched them go for 1 second. Then she turned toward the sound of Holt's boots. The storm came from the northwest, the way the bad ones always did in canyon country. Jesse had smelled it on the ledge for an hour before it arrived, that particular electricity in the air that precedes desert lightning, the scent of rain hitting hot stone 30 miles away, and the wind carrying it forward like a warning. The clouds had been building since late afternoon, enormous and dark, stacking themselves over the canyon walls in towers that swallowed the stars 1 section at a time. By full dark, the thunder was close, and the first lightning was hitting the ridgeline to the north, bright and instantaneous, turning the canyon silver. For a fraction of a second before the dark came back heavier than before. Jesse lay on the ledge and used each lightning strike the way a scout uses a signal flare. In the white flash, 1 full second of perfect visibility. He could see the yard, the guard positions, the cell block doors, the elevated walkway. Then dark again, and he'd add what he'd seen to the picture he was building. He'd been on the ledge for most of 2 days. His leg had made a case against it several times. He'd overruled the leg each time, repositioning to take the weight off the wrapped section, finding angles on the stone that distributed the pressure better. He'd eaten cold and drunk sparingly and stayed as still as the stone around him, which was something the army had taught him and the canyon had reinforced. A still man on a ledge above a canyon was invisible. Motion was what got you seen. He'd seen the hand signal in the afternoon of the first day, and he'd understood it completely. She was ready. He'd adjusted his own planning to account for that information. He wasn't going in to create the situation. He was going in to support a situation she was already creating. That distinction mattered tactically. It meant he needed to be precise about when he moved and what he prioritized. The lamp on the elevated walkway post was his first shot. Taking out the light source served 3 purposes. It reduced the guard's visibility in the yard. It created a moment of confusion that gave the people streaming from the cell block a window to move through, and it signaled to Kaya that he was in position and active. He'd made that shot the moment he heard the first sledgehammer swing. The sound of the sledgehammer hitting the first lock was enormous in the night, amplified by the canyon walls in a way that Kaya might not have fully accounted for from inside. Jesse had heard it clearly from the ledge, and he'd moved immediately, not waiting for the second swing, because the first swing meant she was going, and the window was open right now. He put the first shot into the walkway lamp, and the yard went darker. The impaired guard on the walkway had been slumped against the railing for the better part of an hour, moving with the slow, uncoordinated quality of a man whose body was disagreeing with his intentions. When the lamp went out, he tried to stand and didn't fully manage it, and grabbed the railing and stayed where he was. Jesse watched the main entrance of the structure. Holt hadn't appeared yet. The cell block was spilling people into the yard. Jesse counted them in the lightning flashes, in the half-second windows of white clarity. 8, 12, more. They were moving with purpose, not panicking, staying low, directing each other. Someone in the front of the group was organizing the movement toward the yard entrance, and whoever that was knew what they were doing. Jesse covered the main entrance from the ledge. He found the second yard lamp in the darkness and put a shot through it. More dark. A man appeared in the doorway of the main structure, and Jesse put his rifle on him and then identified him as one of the compromised guards, moving with that underwater slowness that the nightshade produced, and held his shot. The man stood in the doorway and looked at the yard with unfocused confusion and then sat down against the doorframe. Jesse kept watching. Then Holt came through the side exit. Not the main door, the side exit on the east face of the processing building, a door Jesse hadn't known about. Holt came out fast and low, already reading the yard, already past the initial confusion, his pale eyes cutting through the dark with the professional competence of a man who had dealt with unexpected situations before and had learned to process them quickly. He saw the cell block doors standing open. He saw the people moving. He saw Kaya. She was at the far end of the cell block line, the sledgehammer in her hands, and she'd turned toward the sound of Holt's exit. And now they were looking at each other across the width of the yard with 15 freed prisoners moving between them. Holt raised his pistol. Jesse had one clear shot from the ledge before Holt moved back into the structure's shadow. He took it, aimed at the pistol, not at Holt, because a dead man at a mine camp before any of this reached a court was a different kind of problem than a disarmed one. The shot was 40 yards at a moving target in near darkness, with the wind picking up. He grazed Holt's gun hand. It wasn't a disarm. It was enough. Holt's shot went into the dirt, and he pulled his hand back and stepped into the building shadow, and Jesse lost the sight line. He was already moving off the ledge. The secondary entrance crack was narrow, and the descent was steep, and his leg made every one of its complaints known in explicit detail as he scrambled down the rock face with his rifle across his back, and his hands doing most of the work. He hit the base of the crack and went through the secondary entrance into the lower yard, before the thunder that followed the most recent lightning strike had finished rolling through the canyon. The rain started. Not the preliminary spatter that warns you. The full thing, immediate and serious. The kind of desert rain that makes up for its infrequency with its intensity. Within 30 seconds, it was a downpour, hard enough to sting, cold enough to shock, and the already dark yard went darker because the rain was its own kind of curtain. Jesse moved along the base of the processing building wall, rifle up, the way he'd moved in worse conditions in worse places during the scout years. Fast and low and pressed to the wall, so anything ahead of him was silhouetted against whatever ambient light remained. He could hear the freed prisoners moving through the main entrance. Garcia, or whoever the organizer was, had them well in hand. A controlled exit, not a run. People supporting each other, moving together. He heard Kaya before he saw her. Her footsteps were quick and purposeful, coming along the west face of the structure, and he stopped and waited, and she came around the corner with the sledgehammer in both hands and almost ran into him. They stopped, 2 feet apart. Her face was wet with rain. There was a cut on her jaw, recent, still tracking blood, that the rain was thinning to pink. The manacle marks on her wrists had reopened at some point, probably, during the sledgehammer work. Her eyes were completely clear. She looked at his check. Automatic, the same thorough observation she'd applied to injured horses. Still working? She said. Still working, he said. 1 second of that, and then both of them were moving. Holt came out of the main structure's front door. At the same moment, Jesse and Kaya came around the north corner of the processing building. The thunder hit directly overhead, enormous, the kind that's not a sound so much as a physical event, and the lightning that preceded it by half a second lit the entire yard in white. In that white flash, Jesse saw everything. Holt with his gun hand wrapped in his shirt, his left hand now holding his pistol, because the graze on his right hand had made the grip unreliable. 2 of his riders behind him, the ones who hadn't been at the evening meal, standing in the doorway with their weapons up. The elevated walkway guard, finally on his feet, holding the railing, trying to orient himself. The fourth guard, the one Jesse had lost track of, visible at the main entrance gate, blocking the exit. Kaya saw the same things in the same flash. The lightning went out, and the dark came back, and the thunder rolled, and the rain came harder. Jesse said, close to her ear, "Gate guard first. He's blocking the exit." "I see him," she said. "Can you get to the gate without crossing Holt's line?" "Along the east cell block wall." "Yes." "Go," he said. "I've got Holt," she went. Jesse stepped out from the corner of the processing building into the rain. "Holt!" he called. The yard was very dark between lightning strikes, the rain a solid sound that swallowed the lesser noises, and he knew Holt couldn't locate him precisely. He moved after calling. 3 steps left, because a man who stays where he called from is a man who gets shot where he called from. Lightning again. Shorter interval now, the storm directly overhead. Holt turned toward where Jesse had been standing, not where Jesse was. Jesse moved right, circling, keeping to the low side of the yard where the ground sloped slightly toward the drainage channel. He could see Holt scanning for him. He could see the 2 riders in the doorway, uncertain, not firing because they couldn't get a clear target in the rain and the dark. He needed to end this fast. He needed to end it without killing anyone if he could manage it, because dead men at Silver Creek made a complicated story, and a complicated story was what Vance's lawyers would use to muddy the water rights case, to make the whole thing a question of frontier violence rather than corporate contamination and land fraud. He needed Holt alive and functional and deliverable to Thorne. He needed to be smarter than Holt for the next 90 seconds. Lightning, he saw Holt's position. Dark again. He moved. He covered the distance between them in the dark, using the thunder as cover, coming in from Holt's left, because Holt's left hand was the gun hand now, and a left-handed shot to the left is harder than it looks. He hit Holt at chest height, driving with his shoulder the way you drive a fence post, putting all of his weight into it, and they went down together onto the wet dirt. The pistol fired once, wide, into the air. They were on the ground, and it was close and ugly and wet, and the rain was hitting both of them. And Jesse had Holt's gun wrist with both hands and was twisting it, working the joint backward, the direction no joint wants to go, until Holt's hand opened and the pistol hit the dirt. Holt drove an elbow into Jesse's bad leg. The pain was significant. Jesse didn't let the wrist go. He pressed harder past the pain, the way you press past any obstacle when the cost of stopping is worse than the cost of continuing, and Holt made a sound, and the arm went wrong, and Holt went still. Arm lock. Right shoulder. Compromised. Same principle as iron at the forge. You find the weak point, and you apply the right kind of pressure at the right angle, and the material gives. "Don't," Jesse said. His voice was even. He was breathing hard, but his voice was steady. "Think about what comes next before you decide to move." Holt was thinking about it. He could feel the calculation happening in the stillness of the man under him. "You're 2 men in the doorway," Jesse said. "Tell them to put the weapons down." Holt said nothing. Jesse increased the pressure on the arm lock by a specific, controlled amount. Holt called to his men. The weapons went down. At the gate, Kaya had reached the guard. Jesse heard it, but didn't look. He heard the specific solid sound of the sledgehammer's flat face, connecting with something structural. A gate latch, a chain, and then the gate opening, and then the sound of people moving through it. Fast now, Garcia's organized stream becoming a run, now that the gate was clear and the night outside was open. He heard Petra's voice, brief and clear, saying something in Spanish to someone who was hesitating. Then the gate sound behind the last person through it. The walkway guard had made it to the yard level, navigating the steps with the careful deliberateness of the seriously impaired. He stood in the rain and looked at the yard, and sat down again because the rain and the dark and the recent events were more than his current capacity could process. The 2 riders in the doorway looked at Holt on the ground, and at Jesse above him, and then at each other. Jesse looked at them. "Your weapons are on the ground," he said. "Walk to the wall and stay there." They walked to the wall and stayed there. Kaya came across the yard in the rain with the sledgehammer over one shoulder and looked at Holt on the ground, and Jesse above him and the two men at the wall. She looked at the guard sitting in the rain. "Calm, Reedy," she said. The young guard looked up at her. "The workers are through the gate," she said. "Your employer is going to answer to a federal court. You can sit here in the rain and wait to be arrested alongside him, or you can start walking south and make your own decisions about what you do next." Colm Reedy looked at her for a moment. Then he got to his feet with the careful effort of a man whose body was still filing complaints and walked to the gate and went through it and didn't look back. Kaya watched him go. Jesse pulled Holt to his feet, keeping the compromised arm at an angle that made resistance uncomfortable. Holt stood, wet and pale-eyed, and evaluating, running the arithmetic one more time. "You're done," Jesse said. "Not because I say so, because the arithmetic came out that way." Holt looked at him, then at Kaya. "The surveys," Holt said. His voice was steady, which Jesse had to respect even now. "Are going to Marshal Thorne," Kaya said, "along with Jesse's military logs and the testimony of 15 people who just walked out of your employer's illegal labor operation." Holt was quiet. The rain came down on all of them equally. "You worked for a man who poisoned a water basin," Jesse said. "Who ran forced labor out of an old mine and called it debt. Who falsified court documents and held a woman in chains." He paused. "Whatever Vance paid you, it wasn't enough for what you're about to answer for." Holt said nothing. Jesse kept the arm lock and looked at Kaya over Holt's shoulder. She was standing in the rain with the sledgehammer and the cut on her jaw and her wrists raw from the week in irons, and she was looking at him with that clear, direct attention that he'd learned to read over 6 weeks of shared ground. She was taking stock of what was in front of her, assessing, cataloging. She was also, he realized, doing the same thing she'd done on the auction crate, in bitter well, standing upright in a bad situation and refusing to perform anything for anyone watching. Not triumph, not relief, not any of the things the situation might have seemed to call for. Just her own self on her own terms in the rain. Jesse looked at the two men at the wall and at Holt, and at the unconscious guard by the door frame who'd never made it to the yard. "We need rope," he said. "Storage room," she said. "Third door on the left." He looked at her. "I had 5 days," she said. They secured Holt and his 2 riders to the post in the main yard with rope from the storage room and Jesse's belt and a length of wire from the processing building's equipment supplies. Not cruelly. Tight enough to hold, loose enough to breathe, out of the rain under the processing building's overhang. Jesse checked the knots twice. He'd learned knots from a river guide in his 3rd year of scouting, and he'd never forgotten them because the guide had said, "The knot that fails is the one you checked once." Holt watched him work and said nothing. The walkway guard was sitting against the wall under the overhang, more coherent now, but still in no condition to be a problem. Jesse left him untied. He was 20 feet from the others and couldn't help them and couldn't go anywhere useful. Kaya went to the storage room and came back with the surveys. She'd had them inside a leather tube that she'd found in the storage room and wrapped in oilcloth and tied behind a loose stone in the wall of her cell. She'd moved them there the 2nd night, when she'd worked her first loose screw far enough to get her hand through the door gap and reach the hiding spot she'd identified in the corridor. Jesse watched her unroll the tube and check the documents in the minimal light from the remaining lamp. She ran her finger down the first page, checking for damage. The oilcloth had done its work, and the documents were dry. She rolled them back up and put them inside her shirt. Jesse adjusted the wrap on his leg, which had shifted during the fight, and retied it with the methodical focus of a man addressing a practical problem because the practical problem was manageable, and everything else about the last hour was still landing. "Your jaw," he said. She touched the cut, looked at her fingers. "It'll keep," she said. It needs cleaning. When we're somewhere that has water and light. She looked around the Silver Creek yard, at the secured men and the open cell block doors, and the rain washing the dirt in channels toward the drainage grate. When we're somewhere that isn't this. Fair, Jesse said. He picked up his rifle and checked it. She picked up the sledgehammer and then set it down and picked up one of the rifles from the pile of confiscated weapons near the wall instead, because a rifle had better range, and range mattered on the road south. They stood in the rain for a moment. There was a lot in that moment. Jesse could feel the weight of the last week in it, the timber and the fire and the leg and the 2 days on the ledge, and the nighttime scramble down the rock face and the close work in the mud with Holt. He could feel the whole of it in his body, in the particular way that the body tallies things when the immediate danger has passed, and you're standing still for the first time. He looked at Kaya. She had the same thing written in her posture, the physical truth of a week in a cell, and 5 days of careful preparation, and the last 2 hours of moving and hitting and organizing 15 people through a gate in a thunderstorm. She met his eyes. He said the only thing that seemed relevant. You ready to ride? She looked at the gate, the open desert beyond it, the dark road south toward Bitterwell, and then further south toward Cimarron Canyon, and the legal reckoning that waited. I've been ready, she said. They went through the gate. The storm was beginning to ease, the lightning moving south now, the intervals between strikes lengthening. The thunder still rolled through the canyon, but it was rolling away, not toward them. The rain was lighter. The road south was wet and dark and long. They found the horses where Jesse had left them, back in the secondary entrance crack, his roan, and a second horse from the Silver Creek corral that Kaya had noted and planned on taking before she'd made her first move. She'd thought of everything. He'd given up being surprised by this. He mounted up the leg, complaining in a voice he was learning to negotiate with, rather than listen to, and looked at her on the second horse. She was adjusting the rifle in its scabbard, checking the fit. Heman will have reached Thorn by now, Jesse said. If he rode straight through, he'd have ridden straight through. She settled in the saddle and looked south. The rain was still falling, lighter now, and the road was visible in the returning starlight as the clouds began to break. Thorn needs more than what Heman carries, she said. He needs the surveys and the logs and the testimony of witnesses. He needs all of it in front of him at the same time, so Vance's lawyers can't pick at one piece while the others are still traveling. I know, Jesse said. That's why we're riding tonight. She looked at him. The cut on her jaw had stopped bleeding. Her wrists were raw, and the rain had cleaned them, and they'd deal with the rest later. Jesse, she said. He looked at her. She seemed to be deciding whether to say something. He waited, the way he'd learned to wait with her, without filling the space. Thank you, she said, for following the marks. He held her eyes for a moment. Thank you, he said, for making them. Then they rode. The storm moved south ahead of them like something clearing the road, and the stars came out behind them, one section at a time, and the canyon country opened up wide and dark and enormous on all sides, and 2 riders moved through it at a pace that said they had somewhere to be and the intention to get there. Behind them at Silver Creek, 3 men sat tied to a post in the rain and waited for whatever came next. Ahead, Bitterwell, and then the long road home, and a marshal who had some reading to do. They rode into Bitterwell at noon. The town looked the same as it always did. Sun-beaten, dusty. The kind of place that minded its own business because minding other people's business had never paid well out here. But word traveled fast in canyon country, and by the time Jetse and Kaya tied their horses at the post, outside the trading post, people were already gathering. Not a crowd like the auction. Something quieter, ranchers and their wives. A few homesteaders. Jesse recognized from the lower valley. Old Clarence from the feed store, standing with his hat in his hands. Marshal Donald Thorne was already there. He was a tall man, Thorne, with a gray mustache and the particular stillness of someone who'd spent 30 years making decisions in places where bad decisions got people killed. He stood in the center of the square with Heman Cross beside him, and when Jesse and Kaya rode in, he looked at them both for a long moment without speaking. Then he looked at Kaya's wrists. "Miss," he said. "Marshal," she said. Heman stepped forward. He looked at Jesse's leg, at Kaya's jaw, at the general state of two people who had ridden through a night and a storm and a week of hard things. He didn't say anything. He just put a hand briefly on Jesse's shoulder, and that was enough. Thorne gestured toward the trading post steps. "Let's sit down. I've been reading what Mr. Cross brought me, and I've got questions." They sat on the steps in the noon sun. Kaya produced the survey documents from the oilcloth tube. Jesse pulled the military logs from where he'd been carrying them inside his coat for 2 days. He set them on the step between himself and Thorne without ceremony. Thorne picked up the logs first. He read the way Jesse's mother had taught Jesse to read. Slowly, every line, the square around them, filled in gradually. The ranchers from the lower valley came closer. A woman Jesse didn't know came and stood near Kaya with a cup of water and held it out, and Kaya took it and drank without comment. "These cross-references," Thorne said, his finger on the 4th page of the logs. "Your notations here match the basin source listed in the territorial survey." "Yes," Jesse said. "That's 2 independent documents from 2 different periods, both placing the water rights with the original claimants." "That's right." Thorne set the log down. He picked up the survey. He read that too, the same way. Nobody in the square talked much. A few of the ranchers were reading over each other's shoulders at the pages Thorne had set aside. Clarence from the feed store was listening, with his eyes closed, the way some men listen when they want to catch everything. After a while, Thorne set the survey down and looked at Kaya directly. "You've been holding these documents for 2 years." "Yes." "While Vance's man was hunting you." "Yes." "Why didn't you bring them to a marshal sooner?" Kaya looked at him evenly. "Which marshal?" "The justice of the peace in Vance's county signed the paper they used to chain me to an auction crate. The district office has 2 men on Vance's payroll. I needed to reach someone who wasn't already decided." She paused. "That took time." Thorne held her gaze. Whatever he was looking for in her face, he seemed to find it. He nodded once, turned to the ranchers assembled around them, and stood up. "I want statements," he said to the crowd. "Anyone with direct knowledge of contaminated water, dead livestock, or land interference connected to Vance's operation. I want names and dates and specific facts. No speculation. Mr. Cross will write it down." Heman pulled a ledger from his coat pocket. He'd come prepared, which was exactly like him. The ranchers started talking. It took 2 hours. Thorne stood in the square and listened, and Heman wrote, and Kaya sat on the steps and gave her own account, clear and sequential, beginning with the land office raid 2 years ago and ending with the gate at Silver Creek the night before. She spoke without dramatics. She said what happened and what she saw and what she knew, and she drew a clean line between what she'd witnessed directly and what she was inferring. And Thorne listened to all of it with the focused attention of a man constructing something solid. By mid-afternoon, it was done. Thorne had a stack of signed statements and 2 corroborating documents, and the testimony of 15 freed workers who Garcia had organized into a group at the edge of the square waiting. Thorne went to speak with them. He spent 40 minutes with Garcia and the others, Heman translating where needed. When he came back, he looked at Jesse. "I'm riding to Silver Creek today," Thorne said. "I'll collect Holt and his men. Vance is at his main office in the county seat. I've already sent a rider." He paused. "This is going to federal court. The water rights case alone will take months, but the forced labor charges move faster." He looked at the stack of statements in his hand. "A lot faster." Jesse nodded. Thorne looked at Kaya. "You'll need to be available for testimony." "I'll be available," she said. "You'll need to tell me where you're staying." She looked at Jesse. Jesse looked at her. "Cimarron Canyon," he said. "She'll be at my place." Kaya didn't correct this. She looked back at Thorne with the same steady expression she brought to everything. Thorne tucked the documents under his arm. He looked at both of them for a moment. "You did a reckless thing at Silver Creek," he said. "You also did the right thing. I find those two facts difficult to argue with simultaneously." He shook Jesse's hand. He nodded to Kaya. He walked to his horse. By the time the sun started dropping toward the canyon walls, Thaddeus Vance was in federal custody, and the families in the lower valley were reading documents that said the land they'd been working was theirs. Bitterwell had never been this quiet. It was a good kind of quiet. Spring came to Cimarron Canyon the way it always did. Suddenly, and all at once. One morning the sage was gray, and the next morning it was green, and the canyon wrens were back on the south ridge, loud and argumentative as ever. The red walls caught the early light and held it longer than they did in winter. Everything smelled like rain and new dirt. The forge was being rebuilt. It had taken 3 weeks to clear the burned timber and assess the stone walls. Most of the stone had held. Jesse had designed the rebuild with some improvements. Better ventilation in the chimney stack, a wider door for moving stock iron in and out. The Portillo family had come up from the North Canyon with their 2 oldest boys, and Heman had ridden out and brought a rancher named Aldridge from the East Valley who was handy with stone. And for 4 days, the canyon had been full of the sound of hammers and people. Kaya had worked alongside them. She didn't distinguish between which tasks were hers and which ones weren't. She laid stone and mixed mortar, and when Aldridge's measurements were off on the chimney joint, she told him so plainly and correctly, and he adjusted without argument because the numbers were the numbers. The federal case was moving. It would move for a while yet. Thorne had sent word twice, once to confirm Vance's arraignment, and once to ask for additional documentation about the basin contamination timeline. Kaya had written a detailed account, and Jesse had sent it with a rider. The testimony of Garcia and the other Silver Creek workers had been heard by a federal examiner in the county seat, and the forced labor charges were proceeding on a separate track from the water rights case, which meant Vance was dealing with 2 fires at once. Holt had taken a plea. The details of it were Thorne's business, not Jesse's. The 2 young horses that had shown early contamination signs were healthy now. The whole herd was back in the canyon, moved from the Portillo place. Once the water source was confirmed clean, tested by Kaya's plant method, and confirmed a second time by a territorial water surveyor, Thorne had sent at Jesse's request. The West Seep was still being used as the primary source, while the Northeast Spring cleared itself out over the season. By the end of the month, they'd know if the spring was clean. On the last day of the rebuild, when the new chimney stack was capped and the roof was on, and the forge door hung straight and true on its new iron hinges, Jesse went to the corral. He'd spent the winter working with the prime mare, a buckskin with a steady temperament and excellent feet, the best horse in his current string. She was ready. She'd been ready for a few weeks, but he'd taken his time outfitting her. Good saddle, full traveling kit, saddlebags packed with a month's worth of supplies, clear title papers for the horse herself, made out in Kaya's name, signed and witnessed. He led the mare to the front of the house where Kaya was standing, watching the last of the Portillo family's wagon disappear around the canyon bend. She turned when she heard the horse. She looked at the mare, the saddle, the saddlebags. She understood immediately what it was, because she understood immediately what most things were. She stood very still. She's yours. Papers are in the left saddlebag, everything you need to get west. He kept his voice even. The Highland route is clear this time of year. You know that country better than anyone. Kaya walked to the mare and put her hand on the horse's neck. She stood there for a moment. The buckskin lowered her head and blew out a slow breath. The canyon was quiet around them. Just the wrens up on the south ridge and the sound of the new forge cooling after its first real fire. Kaya looked down the wide road that ran west out of the canyon, the one that opened into the scrubland and then into the long desert miles, and then eventually into the highlands where her mother's family's land was. She stood there and looked at it for a long time. Then she turned the mare around. She walked her back toward the house. She dismounted at the porch steps. She reached into her coat and produced a small pouch tied at the top with braided grass. She held it out to Jesse. He took it and loosened the tie and looked inside. Seeds, small and dark, a dozen varieties at least, sorted by type and packed in dry moss. Heirloom seeds, she said. My grandmother's. Some of them go back 4 generations. She looked at the pouch in his hands. They need planting. Jesse closed the pouch carefully. Kaya went to the side of the porch where the post hole for the new corral section had been dug but not yet filled. She picked up the auger that was leaning against the wall. She set it against the post. She looked at him. You're going to need help setting this, she said. He came and took the other side of the post, and they set it together, working it into the ground, and when it was plumb, Kaya held it while Jesse packed the base dirt. He straightened up. His shoulder didn't grind. It hadn't ground much in weeks. She was looking at him. Her hands were dirty from the postwork, and there was a smear of mortar on her sleeve from the chimney work 3 days ago that she hadn't bothered to fully clean off. The cut on her jaw had healed to a thin line. Her eyes were the same eyes she'd had on the auction crate in Bitter Well, clear and direct, and not performing anything for anyone watching. Freedom doesn't mean running forever, she said. It means having every open road before you and choosing the one where you build a life with your equal. Jesse stood in the spring light of the canyon and looked at her. He didn't have words that were adequate to the moment. He knew that. He also knew, from 6 months of learning how Kaya moved through the world, that she wasn't waiting for adequate words. She was waiting for him to pick up the next post. He did. The wrens argued in the sage above the south ridge. The new forge stood solid in its rebuilt stone. Somewhere west of the canyon, a road ran all the way to the highlands, and it wasn't going anywhere. It would still be there tomorrow. Today there was a corral to finish. This is a work of fiction. All characters and events are products of the author's imagination.